I never imagined I would end up here alone in the vastness of the Congo, a land as beautiful as it is relentless. My name is Jean, a soldier from a distant nation sent to a forgotten conflict where the echoes of colonial wars still resonated. When my unit was ambushed, I lost my comrades, my friends. I found myself alone, injured in a jungle I did not understand, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and shadows. Fear was my constant companion, a persistent whisper in the darkest part of my mind. The first days were a whirlwind of desperation and survival. Without a map or compass, my only guide was the sun lazily moving across the sky. I hunted small animals and gathered unknown fruits, always fearing they might be poisonous. Water was a constant concern. I found it in streams and puddles, but always with the fear of disease. One night, as the fire crackled, I heard footsteps. I thought it was the enemy or maybe wild animals. I hid, clutching my weapon with trembling hands. But what emerged from the darkness was neither human nor beast. It was a group of natives, their faces marked with traditional paints, looking at me with curiosity and caution. They took me in their village, a collection of huts scattered in a clearing. We did not speak the same language, but we communicated through gestures and smiles. They healed me, fed me, and showed me how to live in harmony with the jungle. I learned to respect their customs, their connection with nature, their ancestral wisdom. They taught me to fish with spears, to identify edible and medicinal plants, and to read the signs of the forest. Over time I became one of them, though in my heart I knew I was not. One day while hunting I stumbled upon a patrol of soldiers. My heart stopped. Were they friends or enemies? I hid, observing. They spoke my language, but something about their demeanor made me doubt. I decided to follow them from a distance, hoping to understand their intentions. That night I listened to their conversations. They spoke of a rescue mission for a lost soldier. Was I that soldier? Should I reveal myself? But something held me back. They spoke disdainfully of the people of Congo, of their pacification missions, an excuse for their own interests. I felt a deep betrayal. They were not my saviors. They were the usurpers of this land. I returned to the village with a heavy heart. That night, under a starry sky, the village elder told me a story. He spoke of a lost warrior from another land who found a new home among them. The warrior had to choose between his past and his present, between his homeland and his new family. The story resonated within me. I realized I was no longer just a soldier. I was a protector, a friend, a member of this community. My loyalty had shifted, no longer to a flag or a country, but to these people, to this land. Months, perhaps years, passed. The notion of time faded in the immensity of the Congo. One day a rumor reached the village. The conflict had ended. The foreign soldiers had withdrawn, leaving behind a wounded but free country. I faced a decision. I could try to return to my old life, to a world that no longer belonged to me, or stay in Congo in my new home. The decision was not easy, but when I looked at the faces of my friends, I knew my place was there with them. Today I write this as a reminder of my journey, of a lost soldier who found his way. The Congo, with its mysteries and wonders, is now part of me. I have learned that family is not always blood, but bonds forged in adversity and love. I remain a soldier, but for a different cause, to protect and preserve this land and its people. The war brought me here, but it was peace that I found in the heart of Africa, in the soul of the Congo. In the years that followed, my life took a direction I never could have imagined. I became a mediator between the peoples of the Congo and the outside world. Using my knowledge of both worlds, I helped establish dialogues and build bridges where there had only been conflict and misunderstanding. With each delegation that came, with each aid group or peace negotiator, I shared my story. I spoke of the humanity I found in the village, the wisdom of its elders, and the importance of understanding and respecting local culture and traditions. However, peace is fragile. New tensions arose, threatening to tear apart the delicate fabric we had woven. Armed groups, encouraged by foreign interests, began operating in the region, endangering the village's security and its surroundings. I found myself at the crossroads of my past and present loyalties. My military training, something I had left behind, became relevant once more. We organized the village men and women, teaching them to defend themselves, not to fight a war but to protect their home. their land. It was during one of those training sessions that I saw her for the first time. She was a brave and determined journalist who had come to document the situation. Our worlds were different, but something in her gaze, in her determination, reminded me of myself when I first arrived in Congo. We grew closer, first with caution, then with growing admiration and respect. She wrote about the village, about our struggle, bringing our story to the world. And in the evenings under the stars of Congo, we shared our own stories, finding comfort in each other's presence. Then came the day when the village was attacked. Despite our preparation, nothing could have prepared us for the brutality and surprise of the assault. We fought with everything we had, with the fury of those defending their home. In the chaos of battle, I lost sight of the journalist. When I finally found her, she was wounded, her gaze fading. In that moment, I felt a part of my being break. I carried her to safety, refusing to lose another person I cared about. The following days were a whirlwind of pain and recovery. The village came together to heal the wounded, and I dedicated myself to caring for her. As I watched her fight for her life, I realized how much she meant to me, how much she had intertwined in the fabric of my life. Against all odds, she recovered. Her strength amazed me, and together we began to rebuild what had been lost. The village, wounded but not defeated, rose again, more united and stronger than before. The story of the village, of our struggle and resilience, spread thanks to the journalist's writings. Aid came not only in the form of supplies, but also support and recognition. The village became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of the human spirit. My life, once defined by conflict, now centered on peace and love. I found not only a home in Congo, but also a family, a purpose, and an unexpected love. The war had brought me to this place, but it was in peace that I found my true calling. Now, sitting under the same tree where I wrote my first words in this journal, I look back on my journey. The lost soldier in the Congo found more than refuge. He found a life worth living, a cause to fight for, and a love that transcended borders and conflicts. The Congo, with its winding rivers and vast jungles, remains a place of mystery and challenge. But for me, it is home, and as the sun sets, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I know this is where I belong, where my story continues. I never thought I would return to Gallipoli, a place where history was written in blood and valor, a corner of the world marked by the echoes of past battles. But here I am, sitting in a small cafe in Sanakale, looking out at the strait, wondering what brought me back. My name is James Sullivan. Years ago, my grandfather fought on these lands during World War I. I grew up listening to his stories, the images of heroism and horror etched into my mind. When he passed away, he left me a diary, one he had never mentioned before. Its pages contained accounts of Gallipoli, more vivid and personal than he had ever shared. Today, at 35, after a life far removed from the stories of war, I found myself seeking answers on the same ground that once soaked up the blood of so many young men. It was a cloudy spring day. I walked along the deserted beaches of Gallipoli, where now only monuments and graves remained, tributes to the fallen. With my grandfather's diary in hand, I read his words while trying to imagine him young, running under enemy fire, fighting to survive. April 17, 1915. The landings will begin soon. Nervousness and fear among the men. We don't know what awaits us, but we are ready to fight for our country, he wrote. His words echoed in my head as I looked at the calm waters. How could this place, now so peaceful, have been such a brutal battlefield? Suddenly a sound pulled me from my thoughts, a distant echo like a whisper carried by the wind. I turned, looking for its source, but saw only the hills and the silent ruins. I continued my journey, venturing deeper into the heart of Gallipoli. Each step seemed to take me further into history, each page of the diary bringing me closer to my grandfather. I reached a hill from where I could see a panoramic view of the battlefield. I sat down, opening the diary to a marked page. April 25, 1915. Hell broke loose. I had never seen such chaos. The sea red, the beach a labyrinth of death. But we pressed on because retreat meant defeat. I closed the diary, shutting my eyes, trying to imagine that day. Then the sound returned, clearer this time. It was a voice calling me. I opened my eyes, and for a moment I swore I saw figures in the trenches, shadows of the past moving among the remains. I stood up, staring towards where I thought I saw the figures. But there was nothing, only the wind moving the grass. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. I decided to follow the direction where I believed I saw the shadows. The terrain was uneven, filled with trenches and craters, relics of the war. I walked cautiously, feeling a strange magnetism guiding me. I arrived at a point where the trenches intersected. There on the ground I found something shining under the sun. I bent down to pick it up. It was a worn identification tag, but still legible. Thomas O'Reilly, it read, along with a service number. The name was unfamiliar, but something in me compelled me to keep the tag in my pocket. I continued my journey, delving deeper into the trenches. Each step seemed to reveal more of the past, each corner holding an untold story. Then I arrived at a small clearing. In the center was an old, worn wooden cross. I approached and saw it had a name carved into it. Thomas O'Reilly, the same name as the tag I had just found. I stood there, looking at the cross, feeling an inexplicable connection. It was as if the spirit of Thomas had guided me there to tell his story, to ensure he was not forgotten. I looked around, imagining the soldiers fighting and falling in this very place. I felt a deep sadness, but also overwhelming respect. These lands were not just a battlefield. They were a sanctuary, a place of memory and honor. I opened the diary again, looking for any mention of Thomas, but found nothing. Perhaps he was just one of many names lost to history, one of the many young men who gave their lives in these distant lands. I decided I had to do something to honor Thomas and all those who fought here. I wasn't sure what, but I knew I couldn't let his memory fade. With a new purpose, I closed the diary and stood up. The call of Gallipoli, the echo of its heroes, had brought me here, and now it guided me towards a new mission. Looking one last time at Thomas's cross, I whispered a promise: "You will not be forgotten." With that promise in my heart, I began my return, knowing this was just the first page of a new chapter in my life. Back in Sanakale, Thomas O'Reilly's identification tag weighed in my pocket, a constant reminder of the promise I had made. I decided to research his story, hoping to discover more about the man behind the name. I started by visiting the local museum, a small building filled with war artifacts. Among the exhibits, I found letters, diaries, and photos of soldiers, but nothing about Thomas. However, I was not discouraged. I knew finding information about a specific soldier in such a vast war would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Back at the hotel, I opened my computer and began searching military databases and war records. Hours passed, and gradually I started piecing together the puzzle of Thomas O'Reilly's life. He was a young soldier from Ireland who had joined the British Army. He arrived at Gallipoli as part of one of the first waves of troops. The more I learned about him, the more real he became. He was no longer just a name on a tag. He was a person with dreams, a family, and a story that deserved to be told. I decided to visit the nearby war cemetery the next day. Walking among the graves, I read names and dates, each marking a life and a story. I did not find a grave for Thomas, leading me to think his body might never have been recovered. Sitting under the shade of a tree, I opened my grandfather's diary once more. This time I read it looking for any mention of his comrades, hoping to find some reference to Thomas. And there it was, an entry dated April 30th, 1915. Met a young Irishman today, Thomas O'Reilly, a brave soul with a spirit that even this war cannot seem to extinguish. That connection, though brief, between my grandfather and Thomas moved me. I felt I was meant to uncover this story, to connect these threads of the past. I decided then to create a documentary project, one that would not only tell Thomas's story but also highlight the lives of those who fought and fell at Gallipoli. I wanted their stories to be heard, their sacrifices not forgotten. I spent the next few weeks gathering stories, interviewing historians, and visiting archives. Each story was a testament to the bravery, horror, and humanity found in war. One day, while going through old photographs in the military archive, I found one that stopped me in my tracks. It was a group photo of soldiers posing in a trench, and there in the background was my grandfather, next to a young man I immediately recognized as Thomas O'Reilly. His face, though blurry, radiated a mix of youth and determination. That photo was the missing piece, the tangible link between my grandfather and Thomas. I felt a surge of emotion and responsibility. It was as if my grandfather and Thomas were guiding me on this journey, ensuring their stories were told. My project was becoming bigger than I had imagined. It was becoming a tribute to all those who fought at Gallipoli, a reminder that even though their voices were silenced, their stories lived on. Finally, the documentary was ready to be shared with the world. On the night of the premiere, I felt a mix of nervousness and pride. The room was filled with people, some descendants of Gallipoli soldiers, others simply interested in the history. The lights dimmed and the screen lit up, revealing the first images of the documentary. I narrated the introduction, my voice bridging the past and present. This is the story of Gallipoli, told through the eyes of those who were there. It is a story of bravery, sacrifice, and humanity amid the horror of war. It is a reminder that while battles end, the stories of those who fought them deserve to be remembered. The documentary was well received, touching the hearts of many. At the end, there was a respectful silence, followed by sincere applause. I knew I had achieved my goal. I had given voice to the silent heroes of Gallipoli. After the premiere, an elderly man approached me, his eyes filled with tears. "My grandfather fought at Gallipoli," he said. "I never knew much about what happened there until now. Thank you for telling their story." That night, as I sat alone in my hotel room, I thought about my grandfather, about Thomas, and all the men who fought on those distant fields. I felt a deep peace, knowing I had fulfilled my promise. The call of Gallipoli had been more than a journey into the past. It had been a revelation, an awakening to the importance of remembering and honoring our shared stories. And as the echo of those stories continued to resonate in my heart, I knew my journey had only just begun. The previous night had been brutal. The sound of cannons and the explosion of grenades mingled with the screams of the wounded. Exhausted, I fell into a restless sleep filled with nightmares where I wandered endlessly through a maze. Upon waking, I found myself in a place I did not recognize. I was alone, enveloped in a thick fog that barely allowed me to see beyond my outstretched hands. My comrades, my rifle, even the trenches had disappeared. All that surrounded me was a deathly silence, broken only by my own cautious steps. I began to walk, trying to orient myself, but every step took me deeper into the mist. It didn't take long to realize I was in the middle of a vast labyrinth of abandoned trenches, a maze that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The paths crisscrossed and twisted upon themselves, creating a tangle of passages that defied all logic. As I advanced, the silence was occasionally broken by distant sounds, the echo of footsteps, barely perceptible whispers, the crunch of earth under the weight of something unknown. These sounds kept me in a constant state of alert, but I never managed to see anything more than the shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. At one point, I found a French helmet abandoned on the hardened mud. I picked it up, examining it with curiosity. It was dented and stained with what seemed to be dried blood. I let it fall, and the sound of metal against earth resonated strangely in the air, as if it awakened echoes of past battles. I continued walking, losing track of time. The labyrinth seemed to toy with me, leading me in circles, showing me glimpses of something that hid just out of reach. I began to wonder if I would ever find my way back, or if I would join the lost shadows that, according to stories, wandered through Verdun, forever trapped in their final combat. Then I saw him for the first time, a German soldier as lost and disoriented as I was. We stared at each other through the fog, each evaluating the other. There was a moment of tension, an instinct to fight that gripped us both, but fatigue and confusion kept us immobile. Finally, he spoke in broken French, asking where we were. His voice sounded tired, and in his eyes I saw the same fear and bewilderment that must have reflected in mine. I decided to respond, and thus began an unexpected conversation. Despite being enemies in that place, we were simply two human beings trapped in an endless labyrinth. We decided to join forces, at least temporarily, to find a way out. As we walked, we shared stories of our lives before the war, of our families and dreams. It was strange how the war had brought us to that point, enemies turned companions in misfortune. As we advanced, the labyrinth began to reveal its secrets. We found remnants of old battles, rusted weapons, and diaries worn by time. Each object seemed to tell a story, a memory of the tragedy and heroism that had permeated that place. At one point, we discovered a series of underground tunnels. They were narrow and dark, barely illuminated by faint rays of light filtering from above. My German companion suggested they might be an escape route. Cautiously, we entered the darkness, guided by touch and intuition. The tunnels were a labyrinth in themselves, but as we progressed, we began to notice a pattern in their design. They seemed to lead us towards something, a center that we instinctively knew was important. After what seemed like hours, we arrived at an underground chamber. In its center was a table covered with maps and documents, illuminated by an oil lamp that still burned dimly. The documents were written in various languages and spoke of strategies and battle plans. Among the papers, we found a diary belonging to an unknown general. Its pages detailed a secret operation, a plan to create a labyrinth of trenches that would confuse and disorient the enemy. But something had gone wrong. The labyrinth had become uncontrollable, an entity in itself, trapping friends and enemies alike. As we read, a chilling understanding dawned on us. Verdun was not just a battlefield. It was a trap, a puzzle designed to consume all who dared enter. With this new knowledge, our goal became clear. We had to find the exit from the labyrinth, a path that would lead us back to reality, away from this endless nightmare. Guided by the maps in the diary, we began to plot a route. It was a difficult path, filled with obstacles and hidden traps. But hope drove us, the hope of seeing the open sky again, of breathing air not tainted by fear and death. Our journey took us through desolate landscapes, ruins of what once were trenches and bunkers. With each step, we felt we were getting closer to our goal, but also that the labyrinth resisted, as if it had a will of its own. Finally, we reached what seemed to be the heart of the labyrinth. It was an open field, surrounded by high walls of earth. In the center was an ancient stone structure worn by time. Cautiously, we approached the structure. Inside was a staircase descending into darkness. Without words, we knew it was the path to the exit, the end of our odyssey. We descended together, each step echoing in the silence. The staircase seemed endless, taking us deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth. After what felt like an eternity, we saw a light. At first it was faint, but gradually it grew brighter, filling us with a renewed sense of urgency. The staircase ended in a small tunnel that opened into a clearing. With hearts pounding, we hurried towards the light, finally emerging into the open air. The sun shone brightly, momentarily blinding us. We found ourselves in a field far from the trenches and the war. The labyrinth of Verdun was behind us, but the marks it had left on us would remain forever. They always told me that war changes a person, but they never told me it could change reality itself. My name is Jack Thompson, and this is the story of how I found myself in the middle of a mystery that defies all logic in the scorching sands of the Gulf War. It was 1991, and I was a young soldier full of ideals and a thirst for adventure. My unit was sent to Kuwait to liberate it from Iraqi forces. The images on television did not do justice to the chaos we found there. The sky was always tinted red by oil fires, and the air smelled of gunpowder and fear. In our first week, while patrolling a desolate area, we came across a small village. It was almost deserted except for an old man who stared at us intently. He approached and in broken English warned us of a soldier who never died. We thought it was just the delirium of an old man, but his words haunted me. One night during a routine patrol, we heard gunfire. As we approached, we saw a man fighting alone against a group of enemy soldiers. He was agile, his movements precise, almost supernatural. The strangest thing was that he seemed to be alone, with no support. What happened next was even more surprising. Despite being hit several times, the man did not fall. He continued to fight with a ferocity I had never seen. When the enemies finally fled or fell, he turned to us. His gaze was filled with indescribable pain, and then he simply disappeared into the darkness. My comrades were convinced it was an enemy trick, but I wasn't so sure. I remembered the old man's words and began to wonder if there was something more at play. I decided to investigate on my own. Every time we went on patrol, I asked questions of the locals. Many shrugged, but some whispered about a cursed soldier, a solitary figure doomed to fight forever. One afternoon, while exploring some ruins, I found an ancient inscription. Although it was in a dialect I did not recognize, one word stood out clearly: immortal. Something in those carved letters sent a chill down my spine. My curiosity led me to a small museum in Kuwait City. There, an elderly historian told me a local legend. He spoke of an ancient soldier, a brave warrior who had been betrayed and murdered by his own men. Cursed by his thirst for revenge, his spirit found no rest, doomed to fight in every war that plagued these lands. One night under the moonlit desert, I saw him again. He stood looking at the horizon as if waiting for something. I approached cautiously. "Who are you?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes reflecting centuries of war. "I am he who cannot die, he who is bound to this world by betrayal and pain," he said in a voice that sounded like the wind through the dunes. We talked for hours. He told me about the battles he had seen, the civilizations that had risen and fallen while he continued to fight. His tale was a mix of history and legend, a living chronicle of humanity at its rawest. Before dawn, he stood up. "My time here is coming to an end, but war never ends," he said, looking east. "Remember my story. Share it with the world. Maybe one day peace will prevail, and my soul will find rest." I promised I would, knowing in my heart that his curse was a grim reminder of the horrors of war. I returned home with a changed perspective. The war had shown me the worst and the best of humanity. The story of the soldier who never died became a part of me, a tale I shared with anyone who would listen. And although the Gulf War had ended, I knew that somewhere the soldier was still fighting, waiting for the day the world finally learned to live in peace. Now, years later, as I write these words, I wonder about the fate of the immortal soldier. Would he ever find peace? Or would he continue to be an eternal witness to human battles? The only thing I know is that his story is a constant reminder of the costs of war and the importance of seeking peace. In the sands of time, he remains a symbol of resilience and hope, the soldier who never died. Years passed, but the story of the immortal soldier stayed with me. I retired from active service but could never completely distance myself from military life. I became a historian specializing in Middle Eastern conflicts. The image of the tormented soldier drove me to seek the truth in war stories. One day, while researching old archives, I found a document dating back to World War I. It spoke of a nameless soldier who appeared on the most brutal battlefields, fighting with supernatural skill. The description surprisingly matched the man I had met in Kuwait. Could it be the same? I continued my research, unearthing more accounts of this soldier throughout history. Wars changed, armies evolved, but his presence seemed a constant shadow. On a trip to Iraq, searching for more clues, I met an old man who claimed to have seen the soldier during the 2003 invasion. His description was identical. "He does not fight for any side," the old man said. "He fights against war itself." One night, in the same desert where I first saw him, I met him again. It seemed like not a day had passed since our last encounter. "You have sought answers," he said in a weary voice. I told him about my discoveries, about how his legend seemed to transcend time. He listened in silence, his face a mask of sorrow. "War is an eternal curse for some," he finally said. "But your quest for truth, that can be a blessing." I realized that my mission was not just to preserve his story, but to fight against the very idea of war. I began to write, to speak at conferences, sharing not just the legend of the immortal soldier, but also the stories of those affected by war. My work took me to distant places, from the hills of Afghanistan to the streets of Sarajevo. In each place, I shared the soldier's tale, promoting dialogue and understanding. The world kept changing, and with it the nature of war. But my commitment to peace remained firm. The soldier's story became a symbol of resistance against violence and suffering. In a symbolic act, I returned to the desert where it all began. There I planted a tree, a gesture of life in the midst of desolation. Perhaps, I thought, it could be a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest places, life can flourish. Now, at the end of my career, I look back and see how the story of the immortal soldier changed my life. His eternal struggle against war became my own battle for peace. In quiet nights, I sometimes wonder if he still roams some distant battlefield, his unbreakable spirit fighting against hatred and destruction. His story, like that of so many affected by war, is a reminder of our shared destiny and the importance of fighting for a more peaceful world. In the story of the soldier who never died, we find the tragedy of war and the eternal hope for peace. The last shot still echoed in my ears, mixed with the constant buzz of the base generator. I clutched my rifle to my chest, my knuckles white with tension. Cold sweat ran down my back despite the chilly night air. A movement on the edge of the spotlight made me spin around, my heart pounding like a war drum. Nothing, just the elongated shadow of a twisted, grotesque watchtower under the full moon. "Come on, Ramirez, calm down," I murmured, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "It's just nerves. This is your first night watch on this damn base." But the words didn't dispel the knot of terror lodged in my stomach. Since my arrival at this remote desert facility, an unsettling feeling had gnawed at me. The other soldiers whispered about strange occurrences, shadows moving in the dark, muffled screams coming from the abandoned barracks. I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts away. They were just superstitions, stories to scare the rookies. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked in the darkness, something watching and waiting. The sound of footsteps made me tense up. I turned my rifle again, ready. A figure emerged from the gloom, the face hidden under the shadow of a military cap. "Who goes there?" I shouted, my voice rough with fear. The figure stopped, and a guttural laugh broke the silence. It was an inhuman sound, full of malice and mockery. A shiver ran down my spine. "It's me, Ramirez," said the figure, the voice distorted and spectral. "I've come to keep you company." The figure stepped into the light, and I could see his face in the moonlight. It was Sergeant Lopez, a battle-hardened veteran. But there was something different about him, something sinister and unnatural. His eyes glowed with a red light, and a macabre smile spread across his face. I stepped back, terror taking hold of me. "Get away from me, monster!" I shouted, pointing my rifle at him. Lopez stopped, the smile turning into a sneer. "Don't be afraid, Ramirez," he said mockingly. "I just want to show you the truth." He extended a hand towards me, and a red light flashed from his palm. I felt an invisible force pulling me towards him, as if caught in a web. I struggled to break free, but it was useless. "Don't resist, Ramirez," Lopez whispered in my ear. "Join us. The darkness awaits." The red light enveloped me, and I felt my mind disintegrate. Grotesque images and terrifying sounds flooded my senses. I saw mutilated soldiers, their bodies twisted in impossible postures. I heard screams of agony and demonic laughter. Suddenly the red light vanished, and I found myself back in the watchtower. Lopez was gone. I leaned against the railing, trembling and nauseous. "What the hell was that?" I murmured, my voice breaking. I looked around for any explanation, but all I found was the impenetrable and threatening darkness. I spent the rest of the watch in a constant state of terror. Every shadow, every creak made me jump and point my rifle. By dawn, I was exhausted and on the verge of collapse. When the relief soldier arrived, I could barely speak. I muttered something about an apparition and fled the tower, desperate to escape that cursed place. I ran through the base, ignoring the stares of the other soldiers. I reached my barracks and locked myself inside, trembling and sobbing. I couldn't sleep all night. The images of Lopez's apparition and the visions of hell haunted me. The next day, I went to the base doctor, hoping he could help me. But the doctor looked at me skeptically and prescribed tranquilizers. He said I was suffering from post-traumatic stress and needed rest. I didn't believe him. I knew what I had seen was real, that something evil was lurking on that base. But no one believed me. They treated me as if I were crazy. I decided to investigate on my own. I started talking to the other soldiers, looking for someone who had experienced similar things. I discovered I wasn't alone. Other soldiers had seen shadows, heard voices, and felt strange presences. Some had even disappeared without a trace. The more I investigated, the more convinced I became that the base was cursed. There was something dark and powerful that fed on the soldiers' fear and suffering. I decided I had to do something. I couldn't let that malevolent entity keep tormenting my comrades. I gathered a group of soldiers who shared my suspicions. Together, we planned to investigate the abandoned barracks, where paranormal activity was said to be most intense. One night, armed with flashlights and rifles, we ventured into the barracks. The air was thick and oppressive, and a smell of damp and rot permeated the environment. We moved through the dark corridors, lighting the walls with our flashlights. Shadows danced around us, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the pounding of our hearts. We reached a large room where the disappearances were said to have occurred. The air was even heavier here, and an unnatural cold enveloped us. Suddenly, the flashlight beams flickered and went out. We were plunged into absolute darkness and silence. Then we heard a sound. It was a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the walls. We looked at each other, terror reflected in our faces. We pointed our rifles into the darkness, ready for whatever might come. The moan grew louder, and we heard other sounds. Macabre laughter, cries of pain, the clanking of chains. The walls began to tremble, and the floor cracked beneath our feet. We felt something malevolent approaching, something that wanted to devour us. We fired our weapons into the darkness, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The sound of gunfire mixed with the screams and laughter, creating a cacophony of terror. Suddenly, a red light flooded the room. It was the same light I had seen in Lopez's eyes, the light of the malevolent entity. The light blinded us, and we felt an invisible force pulling us towards it. We struggled to break free, but it was useless. The red light enveloped us completely, and we felt our minds disintegrating. When I woke up, I was in my barracks, sweating and trembling. The other soldiers who had entered the barracks with me were by my side, equally terrified and confused. We couldn't remember anything that had happened after the lights went out. It was as if we had been erased from existence for a time. We knew we had to escape that base, that we were in grave danger, but we couldn't leave without warning the others. We decided to write a detailed report of our experiences and send it to the military command. We hoped they would believe us and send someone to investigate, but we received no response. Our superiors ignored our warnings, treating us as if we were crazy. Desperate, we decided to desert. We left the base in the middle of the night, taking only the essentials. We fled through the desert, guided by the stars. We knew we were being pursued, but we didn't stop. After days of walking, we reached a small town. There we found refuge and help. Over time, the physical and emotional wounds began to heal. But we never forgot what we experienced on that cursed base. The malevolent entity is still there, waiting for its next victim, and we remain its witnesses, the ones who know the truth. It was a night like any other during our deployment in that inhospitable desert, a routine convoy transporting supplies to a forward base. I, Sergeant Major Rodriguez, led the operation. Next to me was Lieutenant Garcia, a young officer full of energy and ambition. Behind us, a line of armored vehicles transporting our brave soldiers. The night was dark, with no moon or stars. Only the light of our headlights cut through the infinite blackness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the roar of the engines and the crunch of sand under the wheels. Suddenly, without warning, all hell broke loose. A blinding flash lit up the night sky. A deafening explosion shook the ground. The first vehicle in the convoy was hit directly, turning into a ball of fire. "Ambush!" I shouted, my voice barely audible above the chaos. "Everyone take cover." But it was already too late. The invisible enemy in the darkness had surrounded us. Bursts of automatic fire raked our vehicles. Cries of pain and terror filled the air. "Garcia!" I shouted. "Organize the defense. I'll try to contact the base." I dived out of the vehicle, rolling in the sand to avoid the bullets. I pulled out my radio and began transmitting a distress signal. "Mayday! Mayday! Convoy Alpha under attack. We need immediate reinforcements." But the radio only emitted static. The signal was jammed. We were alone. I crawled to a sand mound, using my rifle for support. I looked around, trying to assess the situation. The convoy vehicles burned like funeral torches. The bodies of my comrades lay scattered on the ground, motionless. Some still moved, writhing in pain. The enemy kept firing, but I couldn't see them. They were shadows in the dark, ghosts stalking us from the shadows. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall man dressed in a black uniform and a visor helmet. He held an assault rifle in his hands and had a look of hatred in his eyes. I aimed my rifle and fired. The man fell to the ground, but another immediately took his place, and then another, and another. There were too many, too strong, too fast. I was forced to retreat, seeking refuge behind an overturned vehicle. I reloaded my rifle and kept firing, but my bullets seemed to have no effect. I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I looked down and saw that a bullet had pierced my thigh. Blood poured out, staining the sand red. I applied an improvised tourniquet and crawled inside the overturned vehicle. I stayed there, hidden in the dark, waiting for my fate. I could hear the enemy's footsteps approaching. I could feel their hot breath on my neck. I closed my eyes and prepared for the worst. But the final blow never came. Instead, I heard a deafening roar, a sound that chilled my blood, a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of something inhuman. I opened my eyes and saw a scene that defied all logic. The enemy was being massacred, torn apart, destroyed. A gigantic creature towered over them, a dark silhouette against the night sky. It had the shape of a man, but was much bigger, much stronger. Its eyes glowed with an infernal red light. Its claws were as sharp as blades. Its teeth were blood-stained fangs. The enemy soldiers screamed in terror, but their cries were drowned out by the beast's roars. They tried to flee, but were caught and torn apart like rag dolls. The creature moved with supernatural speed and agility. It jumped from side to side, dodging bullets and explosions. Its claws tore through flesh and metal with equal ease. I watched as it lifted a soldier into the air and ripped him in two with its bare hands. I saw it bite off another's head. I saw it crush a third underfoot. It was a slaughter, a bloodbath, hell on earth. The creature kept killing until no one was left alive. Then it turned to me, its red eyes fixed on mine. I felt paralyzing terror. I knew my time had come, but the creature didn't attack me. Instead, it approached slowly, its steps echoing in the sand. It stopped in front of the overturned vehicle and leaned towards me. I could feel its hot breath on my face. I could smell the stench of blood and death emanating from its body. I closed my eyes and waited for the final blow, but it never came. Instead, I heard a guttural sound, like a growl. Then the creature moved away and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed there, trembling with fear and shock, until reinforcements arrived. They took me to a field hospital where they treated my bullet wound and gave me a blood transfusion. When I recovered, they interrogated me about what had happened. I told them everything I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They said I was delirious from fever and blood loss. They discharged me from the army with honors, but with a mentally disturbed label. No one wanted to know about me. No one wanted to hear my story. Now, years later, I'm still haunted by the memories of that night. I still see the creature's red eyes in my nightmares. I still hear its roars in my ears. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know where it came from or why it attacked us. But I know it was real, and I know I will never forget it. My name is Captain David Ramirez, and this is the story of how my Special Forces team faced indescribable horrors on a mission that pushed us to the brink of sanity. It all began with an emergency call in the middle of the night, a desperate plea that would launch us into a devastated war zone. Looking back, I remember the sepulchral silence of the base as we prepared for the mission. Each of us, veterans hardened by 1,000 battles, knew this time would be different. The tension was palpable, thick, and suffocating. "Ramirez, are you ready?" asked Sergeant Major Garcia, his grave voice resonating in the darkness. "Always ready, Sergeant Major," I replied, adjusting my bulletproof vest. "This mission stinks of rot," Garcia muttered, shaking his head. "Something doesn't add up." His words echoed in my mind as we boarded the helicopter, the roar of the rotors drowning out any other thoughts. We landed in what was once a prosperous city, now reduced to rubble and ruins. The stench of death and destruction filled the air as the wind howled between the bombed-out buildings. "Damn, this looks like the end of the world," said Corporal Rodriguez, his voice trembling. "Maintain formation and keep your eyes open," I ordered, my heart pounding. We advanced cautiously, every creak of twisted metal and every elongated shadow feeding our paranoia. The streets were deserted, except for the putrefied corpses scattered like macabre offerings. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream broke the silence, followed by a burst of gunfire. We ran toward the sound, finding Lieutenant Mendoza huddled in a corner, his face pale and contorted. "What the hell happened?" I asked, pointing my rifle toward the shadows. Something attacked us," Mendoza stammered, pointing to a dark alley. "They weren't human." My men and I exchanged incredulous looks. What kind of enemy stalked us in this hell? We decided to investigate the alley, advancing with our weapons ready. The darkness was so thick we could barely see our own hands. Suddenly, a grotesque figure emerged from the shadows, its body deformed and its eyes glowing with a sickly light. "Fire!" I shouted, emptying my magazine into the creature. The figure collapsed, but within seconds more emerged from the darkness, their sharp claws and rotting teeth glinting in the moonlight. We were surrounded. We found ourselves in a frenetic battle, firing and dodging the creature's attacks. Their bodies seemed immune to bullets, and their guttural screams chilled our blood. "Damn it, we can't handle them," shouted Sergeant Garcia as one of the creatures tore off his arm. Desperation took hold of us, but we kept fighting tooth and nail. One by one, my men fell, their bodies mutilated by the creature's claws and teeth. I found myself cornered in a dead-end alley, my ammunition exhausted and my body covered in wounds. One of the creatures lunged at me, its jaws wide open. I closed my eyes, awaiting the final blow, but it never came. I opened my eyes and saw Mendoza, his face covered in blood, wielding a bloody knife. He had stabbed the creature in the heart, saving my life. "Run, Ramirez!" Mendoza shouted as more creatures approached. "Run and don't look back." I obeyed, running through the devastated streets, the echoes of screams and gunfire chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the extraction point where a helicopter awaited us. I climbed aboard, exhausted and traumatized. I looked back, seeing the city in flames, a hell on earth. We returned to the base, but none of us were the same. We had seen horrors no human should witness. The nightmares tormented us, the memories of the battle etched into our minds. Mendoza didn't survive his wounds, but his sacrifice allowed us to escape hell. We buried him with military honors, a fallen hero in a war against the unknown. Years later, I still hear the screams of my men, the crunch of broken bones and the stench of death. The physical scars have healed, but the emotional wounds remain open. The crackle of the campfire brings me back to the present, to the cabin in the mountains where I've hidden from the world. The flames dance in the darkness, casting shadows that blend with memories. A decade has passed, but the stench of burnt flesh and the echo of piercing screams still haunt me. I can't escape the island. We were the elite unit, the Ghosts, 12 soldiers selected for our skills and our ability to operate in the shadows. We were sent to Leech Island, a forgotten piece of land in the Pacific, for a training exercise. We were supposed to simulate an infiltration and secure an unknown objective. It seemed routine, but from the start, something felt wrong. The boat approached the shore under the full moon. The sound of waves breaking against the rocks was the only noise breaking the silence. We slid into the water and crawled across the sand to the tree line. The air was dense and humid, filled with the smell of salt and decay. "Stay alert," whispered Captain Ramirez. "We don't know what to expect." We advanced through the undergrowth, our rifles ready. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches intertwining to form an impenetrable canopy. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the beam of our flashlights. After hours of marching, we reached a clearing. In the center was a concrete structure, half hidden by vegetation. A rusty steel door blocked the entrance. "This wasn't in the reports," said Sergeant Major Mendoza. We forced the door open and entered. The interior was a labyrinth of dark corridors and empty rooms. The air was cold and stale, with a metallic smell that turned my stomach. In one of the rooms, we found an operating table stained with blood. Beside it was a container full of rusty surgical instruments. "This looks like a field hospital," said the unit's medic, Lieutenant Gomez. "But there are no patients," I replied. We continued exploring, each step taking us deeper into the nightmare. We found empty cages, broken test tubes, and notes scribbled in a language we couldn't understand. In the lower level, we discovered a refrigeration chamber. The door was open, revealing a scene that froze our blood. There were bodies, dozens of them, piled on top of each other, naked and mutilated. Some had exposed organs, others were missing limbs. All had expressions of horror frozen on their faces. "My God," murmured Captain Ramirez. "This isn't a hospital," said Sergeant Major Mendoza. "It's a slaughterhouse." In a control room, we found a computer that still worked. We accessed the files and discovered the truth. Leech Island wasn't a training base. It was a secret laboratory where inhuman experiments were conducted on human beings. The subjects were prisoners of war, criminals, and missing persons. They were subjected to torture, mutilation, and genetic experiments. The results were monstrosities that barely resembled humans. "These bastards," growled Captain Ramirez. "We have to get out of here and tell the world what's happening," I said. But it was too late. The doors locked, the lights went out, and the alarms began to sound. We were trapped. We were attacked by the creatures they had created. They were fast, strong, and brutal. We killed many, but there were too many. We lost Gomez and 2 of our men. We managed to escape the base, but the entire island seemed to be against us. They chased us through the jungle, attacked us on the beach. We lost 2 more men. In the end, only 6 of us remained, wounded, traumatized, but alive. We were rescued by a fishing boat that found us adrift on an improvised raft. We returned home, but we weren't the same. We were marked by what we had seen and done. The government silenced us, erased us from the records. We became ghosts. Some of us died under mysterious circumstances. Others disappeared without a trace. I hid, trying to forget, but I can't. The island haunts me. The screams torment me. I know I can't keep running. I have to tell the truth. I write this as a testimony, as a warning. Leech Island is not just a memory, it's a threat. The experiments continue. The creatures are still out there. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I don't know if I can stop them, but I have to try. For those who died, for those who still suffer, for humanity. The campfire dies out. The darkness surrounds me, but I know I'm not alone. The ghosts of Leech Island are with me, and together we will fight for the truth. "We should never have gone in there," Sergeant Ramirez repeated over and over, his voice trembling and his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the campfire. We were a group of soldiers gathered around the fire, our faces pale and contorted, reflecting the horror we had witnessed that night. It all began as a simple training exercise. We were a platoon of 20 men sent to a remote, wooded area to simulate a nighttime combat scenario. The darkness was impenetrable, broken only by the faint glow of our flashlights and the crunch of leaves under our boots. In the midst of the chaos and confusion of the exercise, I got separated from the group. I stumbled upon a half-buried bunker, its entrance blocked by branches and undergrowth. Curiosity got the better of my judgment, and I pushed the rusty door open. The interior of the bunker was a world of shadows and silence. The air was dense and humid, with a smell of mold and decay that turned my stomach. I turned on my flashlight and cautiously advanced, my steps echoing in the void. The walls were covered in graffiti and strange symbols, some too disturbing to describe. There were rusted bunks, overturned tables, and abandoned military equipment scattered on the floor. As I explored the bunker, I came across a locked door. I forced the lock with the butt of my rifle and entered a small, dark room. What I saw there froze my blood. In the center of the room was an improvised operating table stained with dried blood. On it lay rusty surgical instruments and blood-soaked rags. In a corner, a pile of human bones stood like a macabre monument. I stepped back in horror, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I heard a metallic noise behind me and turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall, thin man dressed in a tattered military uniform. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and hollow. He held a bloody scalpel in his hand. "Welcome to my laboratory," he said in a hoarse, guttural voice. "I've been waiting for a new test subject." I tried to scream, but fear paralyzed me. The man approached, his scalpel gleaming in the moonlight that filtered through a crack in the ceiling. I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable. But the attack never came. Instead, I heard a blood-curdling scream followed by a thud. I opened my eyes and saw the man convulsing on the floor. Beside him stood Sergeant Ramirez, clutching his combat knife. "Let's get out of here," Ramirez shouted, grabbing my arm and dragging me out of the room. We ran through the bunker, our hearts pounding. We emerged into the forest and regrouped with the rest of the platoon. We told them what we had seen, but they didn't believe us. They thought we were crazy or hallucinating from the stress of the exercise. But we knew the truth. We had seen the horror with our own eyes, and we knew we would never forget that night in the abandoned bunker. We returned to the base, but the nightmare didn't end there. Sergeant Ramirez began having terrible nightmares and showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was discharged from the army, and no one ever heard from him again. I also struggled with the demons of that night. The memories of the bunker, the man with the scalpel, and the pile of human bones haunted me. I sought psychological help, but nothing seemed to ease my pain. Over time, I learned to live with my demons, but I never forgot what I saw in that abandoned bunker, and I know I will never be the same. Now, years later, I'm still tormented by unanswered questions. Who was that man with the scalpel? What experiments was he conducting in that bunker? And what happened to Sergeant Ramirez? I may never know the answers. But one thing is certain. I will never forget the horror I witnessed that night. And I will always remember Sergeant Ramirez's words. We should never have gone in there. I clearly remember the sensation of humidity clinging to my skin, as if the jungle itself were trying to drag us into its dark heart. This wasn't my first mission in Chiapas, but something in the air that morning foretold it would be different from the rest. The morning mist hung over us with a density that seemed to swallow sounds and light, transforming the jungle into a labyrinth of shadows and silence. This wasn't a typical reconnaissance mission. Something was terribly wrong, but none of us could pinpoint exactly what. Lieutenant Alfonso had gathered us at dawn. His usually impassive face showed lines of worry. Squad, our objective is simple. Recon the designated area and return before nightfall. Keep the radio on and stay together. His words, though calm, carried a weight that made us exchange uneasy glances. At that moment, none of us could imagine it would be the last time we'd see the base camp. The terrain was deceptively calm, with the songs of birds and the rustle of leaves. But as we advanced, a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd swear I saw shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, but turning around revealed only the dense vegetation swaying with the breeze. It was around midday when we realized something was very wrong. Our compass spun erratically, and the radio signal returned only static hums. Lieutenant Alfonso tried to maintain calm, ordering a pause to try and reorient ourselves. But the jungle, which had been full of life until then, fell into a deathly silence. It was as if nature itself held its breath. We attempted to retrace our steps, but the marks we had left on the trees seemed to have vanished. The daylight began to wane, plunging the jungle into premature twilight. That was when we heard them for the first time. Whispers that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, accompanied by the sound of footsteps that belonged to none of us. Panic was palpable in the air as night finally enveloped us. Without the ability to set up a proper camp, we huddled together, back to back, trying to fend off the darkness with our weak flashlights. The whispers intensified, transforming into unintelligible voices that seemed to mock our situation. With the first light of dawn, we moved, guided more by desperation than any sense of direction. It was then that we found it, a village that wasn't on any of our maps, consumed by vegetation but clearly abandoned for years. The wooden structures, rotted by time, stood like monuments to desolation. We cautiously entered, each step echoing ominously in the silence. The village seemed to have been evacuated hastily, the inhabitants' belongings scattered like the final notes of an unfinished symphony. But what froze the blood in my veins were the faces watching us from the broken windows, photographs of our comrades who had disappeared on previous missions, their empty eyes following our every move. We didn't need words to communicate the horror we all felt. Lieutenant Alfonso ordered an immediate retreat, but when we turned, we discovered the jungle had closed off the path we had come from. We were trapped, with the unsettling feeling that the village and its ghosts had more stories to tell. Day faded again, and with it our hopes of finding a way out. Tension grew among us, fueled by fear and distrust. The night whispers began earlier, more intense, as if the darkness itself spoke to us. And in that eternal night, I lost track of hours, minutes, and seconds, submerged in a terror that seemed to spring from the very earth. What happened next I recall only through a veil of fear and confusion. The screams of my comrades, the faces in the windows multiplying, the feeling that something ancient and malevolent had claimed us as part of its inscrutable domain. Darkness enveloped us completely, and in it we fought not only against shadows, but against the madness that threatened to consume us. Now, as I write this with trembling hands and a mind besieged by memories I wish I could forget, I know the story of the lost patrol has become part of the mystery that envelops these ancient and forgotten jungles. I don't know what was real and what was a product of the terror that besieged us, but of one thing I am certain. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows of abandoned and forgotten places. Perhaps this story serves as a warning to those who dare to venture into the darkness of the jungle in search of its lost secrets. For some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places unexplored. And sometimes all we can do is hope to see the light of day once more and be grateful for each dawn granted to us. I've always thought that the jungle hides more secrets than we're willing to admit. But what we found that day in the depths of the jungle near the border with Guatemala surpassed anything my rational mind was prepared to accept. Our mission was routine, or so we believed. We had been sent to investigate a series of reports about illegal activities in the region. But what we discovered had nothing to do with smugglers or drug traffickers. It was the footprints, enormous, inexplicable, as if a giant had walked the earth, leaving its indelible mark in the mud and vegetation. I remember the moment we saw them for the first time. Silva, the youngest in our group, found them. He called us in a low voice, his tone a mix of awe and fear. As we approached, what we saw left us speechless. Footprints of a magnitude none of us had ever seen. They were too large to belong to any known animal. Curiosity overcame our initial caution. We decided to follow them, delving deeper into the jungle, guided by those monstrous marks that tore through the undergrowth, leaving a clear trail. The vegetation closed around us, and as we advanced, a supernatural silence began to envelop us. It was as if the jungle itself held its breath, watching our every step. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. The usual sounds of jungle life, the bird songs, the buzz of insects, the distant roars of animals, faded to nothing. We found ourselves in a zone where, inexplicably, life seemed to have extinguished. The ground was covered with dead leaves, and the trees stood silent and somber, like sentinels of a forgotten world. The men began to murmur among themselves, uneasy. Some suggested turning back, fearing we were venturing into unknown, dangerous territory. But our training and curiosity pushed us forward. What kind of creature could have left those footprints? How was it possible for such a lifeless place to exist in the midst of one of the world's most vibrant jungles? The afternoon was waning when we reached what seemed to be the end of the trail. The footprints led to a large, flat rock in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The rock was covered in moss and lichen, and the footprints seemed to disappear right at its edge. We stopped, confused and frustrated. How could something so large simply vanish without a trace? It was then that the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. A subtle vibration at first, growing in intensity until we had to grasp the trees to keep from falling. I looked at my companions, seeing my own fear reflected in their eyes. But before we could react, the center of the rock slowly rose, revealing a dark opening beneath. We stood frozen, watching as the earth itself seemed to yield to an unknown force. From the opening emerged a deep sound, a sort of heavy, slow breathing that resonated with a primordial power. Curiosity once again overcame fear. Cautiously, we approached the edge of the opening, peering into the abyss that lay before us. What we saw inside defies rational explanation. It was a large, circular chamber, dimly lit by a light source we couldn't identify. But it wasn't the chamber that took our breath away. It was its content. An immense creature, covered in moss and earth, as if it were part of the jungle itself. It was sleeping, or so it seemed, its chest rising and falling slowly with each deep breath. We had no words to describe what we were seeing. It was as if a fragment of prehistory had been preserved in secret, hidden from the outside world by the jungle's thickness and the passage of millennia. The creature was an enigma, a living mystery that defied our understanding of the natural world. The debate over what to do next was brief but intense. Some wanted to study the creature, others advocated leaving it in peace, fearing the consequences of disturbing its rest. But before we could reach a decision, the creature opened its eyes. They were like two deep wells, reflecting a wisdom and an antiquity that surpassed us. It looked at us one by one, and in that gaze I felt a deep sadness, an ancient pain that transcended language. It wasn't a threat, but a silent plea, a reminder that there are things in this world that must remain hidden, secrets we are not prepared to discover. What we did next, how we managed to leave the jungle and return to our everyday reality, all seems like a blurry dream. But what we found in the depths of that jungle and the gaze of that creature have stayed with me. I know there are stories that should never be told, secrets that must remain buried in the dark heart of the earth. And as I write this with the distance and time softening the sharp edges of fear, I wonder if we did the right thing. I wonder what we are capable of understanding and accepting as reality. But above all, I wonder what ancient dreams might awaken in the unexplored depths of our world, waiting for the moment when human curiosity once again breaks the seal that separates the known from the unimaginable. I never thought I'd return to the jungle of Tamaulipas after everything that happened. But here I am, sitting in the same dusty cantina where it all began so many years ago, the suffocating heat reminding me that some places never change, though we do. People here still talk about what happened, though most only know fragments of the story, whispers of tragedy tinged with fear and superstition. But I was there. I know what happened. And after all this time, I think it's time to tell the true story of the return of the fallen. It all began with a routine mission, or so we were told. Our platoon was sent to a remote part of the jungle to investigate reports of illicit activities. We had done this 100 times before, but something felt different this time. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease we couldn't shake. It was on the third day that things started to go wrong. One of our men, Perez, got separated from the group during an exploration. He was an experienced soldier, knew the protocol, but for some reason that afternoon, he simply disappeared. We searched until darkness made it impossible to continue. That night, no one slept. The jungle's usual comforting silence had turned into a constant reminder of our vulnerability. At dawn, we resumed the search, but Perez was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of struggle, no traces of blood, nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed him. After 3 days, command ordered us to abandon the search and return to base. It was a silent march, each of us lost in our thoughts, wondering what had happened to our comrade. Weeks passed without news, and gradually life at the base returned to normal. But Perez's disappearance became an open wound, an unresolved mystery that haunted us at unexpected moments. It was almost a month later when we received the news. A group of local explorers had found a body in the jungle, sitting against a tree as if resting. There were no signs of decomposition despite the humid and hot conditions that should have accelerated the process. The body was identified as Perez. What I saw when they took me to see the body was unlike anything I had experienced before. Perez was there, his face peaceful as if he had just fallen asleep. But the most disturbing thing was that he showed no signs of having spent weeks in the jungle. His uniform was clean with no tears or dirt, and his skin was as fresh as if he had died just a few hours earlier. Perez's return to the base was met with a mix of relief and terror. Some said it was a miracle. Others whispered about witchcraft or unexplained phenomena. But as I looked at his inert body, a sense of unease took hold of me. There was something about this that didn't fit, something beyond my understanding. The following days were filled with interrogations and medical examinations. The doctors were baffled. They couldn't explain how Perez had remained in such a preserved state. There was no evidence of toxins, diseases, or any discernible cause of death. It was as if he had simply stopped in time. But there was something else that bothered me, beyond the medical enigmas and superstitious rumors. Before disappearing, Perez had been acting strangely, distant. I remembered our last conversations, his lost gaze, his evasive answers. There was something he hadn't told me, a secret he had taken with him into the jungle. I decided to go back to the place where he had been found. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened to my friend, what the jungle had done to him. The journey was long and exhausting, but necessary. Upon arrival, the sense of unease intensified. The jungle seemed calm, but I could feel something watching me, something ancient and mysterious. I approached the tree where Perez had been found, examining the ground, looking for any clues that might have been overlooked, and then I saw it, almost hidden among the tree roots, a small metallic object. I picked it up, cleaning off the mud and leaves. It was an old, worn compass, but it definitely belonged to Perez. But there was something strange about it, something I didn't notice until I looked closer. The needle, instead of pointing north, spun slowly, aimlessly, as if trying to indicate something that couldn't be defined in terms of our simple understanding of the world. At that moment, I knew Perez had found something, or perhaps something had found him, something that didn't belong to our world, something the jungle had kept hidden for centuries. I stood there with the compass in my hand, feeling the weight of a mystery too great to solve. The jungle kept its secret, as it always had, and I realized there were things better left undiscovered. Perez had found one of those things and had paid the price. With a heavy heart, I left the compass on the ground, a tribute to my friend and to the unfathomable mysteries of nature. As I walked away, I couldn't help but look back. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the tree, a barely perceptible silhouette among the light and shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was the spirit of the jungle reminding me that there are things beyond our comprehension. I returned to the base with more questions than answers, but with a new understanding of the limits of our world. The return of the fallen had been a reminder that sometimes it's better to leave some mysteries unsolved. And while life continued with the ever-watchful jungle, I knew that the memory of Perez and the secret he took with him would stay with me forever. Years ago, when the weight of the world seemed less oppressive, I never would have imagined that my most vivid memories would be of sleepless nights under a starry sky, haunted by shadows and whispers in an unforgiving jungle. But here I am, unable to escape the echo of those days in Yucatan, where mystery and terror intertwined in a way I still struggle to understand. It was my third deployment in the region, but nothing in my previous experiences prepared me for what we would face. Our mission was clear: to establish a temporary base for surveillance operations. The jungle, a green labyrinth of life and death, was both our ally and enemy, but there was something else in that place, something hiding in the darkness, watching, waiting. I was assigned to night watch. At first, the nights were quiet, save for the usual sounds of the jungle. But then everything changed. I started seeing them, shadowy figures moving with a logic-defying agility, barely perceptible in the periphery of my vision. At first, I thought they were a product of exhaustion or tricks of the light, but each night they came closer. I tried to talk about it with the others, but my words were met with skepticism. "They're just shadows," they said, "or stress is getting to you." But I knew there was something more, something real and terrifying in the darkness. A week after my first sighting, the evidence became undeniable. Footprints appeared at dawn surrounding our tents as if a congregation of ghosts had danced around us while we slept. They were deep and clearly defined in the damp ground, but they didn't match any known animal. The entire camp fell into fearful silence, the reality of our situation settling like a heavy weight on our hearts. Tension grew with each passing night. The figures no longer hid. They moved boldly at the edges of our light, as if mocking our defenses, our understanding. And then, one night, everything reached a critical point. It was my turn on watch, and the weight of the night felt more oppressive than ever. The jungle was eerily silent, as if anticipating something imminent. And then I saw them. The figures had gathered at the edge of the light, numerous, forming a wavering line that separated light from total darkness. I felt a mix of fear and fascination, unable to move, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Then he appeared. From the very heart of darkness, a figure stood out and began to advance towards the light. He was larger than the others, and as he approached, I saw that he wasn't like the shadows accompanying him. There was something deeply human in his march, a sadness in his posture that chilled my blood. He stopped right at the edge of the light, and although I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was looking directly at me. In that moment, a silent bond formed between us, a tacit understanding that he was the source of it all, the watcher of the night who had brought terror to our camp. There were no words, but a clear message formed in my mind: leave this place. The intensity of the communication was overwhelming, filled with an urgency and pain that were not entirely human. I don't remember how the night ended. I only know that at dawn, I was alone, trembling and soaked in sweat with the certainty that we had to leave. My comrades found me at dawn, and though I didn't need to say anything, the decision was already written on their faces. We abandoned the camp at dawn, leaving behind the jungle and its secrets. There were no more discussions or doubts. What we had experienced transcended language and logic. Now, years later, the memory of those nights still haunts me. Sometimes, on the edge between sleep and wakefulness, I can see the silhouette of the watcher in the darkness of my room, reminding me that there are places in this world that belong to the night, places where the living have no place. And as I sit here writing this, I know there are truths that will never be fully understood, mysteries that must remain unsolved. But one thing is certain: in the Yucatan jungle, there is a watcher who walks in the night, and his message is clear. Leave this place, he warned us, and we fortunately listened. I write this not as a confession, but as a testimony of the inexplicable events I survived. The events I'm about to recount unfolded in the depths of the jungle of Morelos, a place we thought we knew, but that hid secrets beyond our comprehension. Our unit had been sent on a routine reconnaissance, something we had done countless times without incident. But that morning, something was different. The air was charged, heavy, as if it presaged something imminent. Initially, we attributed the feeling to the jungle's usual humidity, but we soon realized we were wrong. The fog appeared without warning, a white, dense tide that slid between the trees with unnatural speed. Within seconds, the camp was enveloped in a thick mist that swallowed everything in its path. I remember the alarmed shout of one of the soldiers, followed by a confusion of voices calling for calm. But the fog was not normal. It had an almost solid quality, enveloping us, isolating each of us in a silent, white world. At first, we tried to stay together, but visibility was reduced to almost nothing. You could be a few meters from someone and not see them. It was then that we started to hear them, voices whispering from the depths of the fog, calling us by our names, begging for help with an urgency that chilled the blood. It was impossible to discern exactly where they were coming from. They seemed to move, surround us, creeping through the trees and the mist. We tried not to separate, but the fog seemed to have a will of its own, pushing us in opposite directions, disorienting us. I remember hearing Martinez, one of the strongest among us, shouting in the distance, his voice full of panic and confusion. I ran towards the sound, but when I arrived, there was no one there, only the thick, silent fog. Time stretched inside that mist. We didn't know how long we had been there. Our watches seemed to have stopped, and the sun didn't filter through the layer of fog. We called out to each other, but our voices seemed to drown a few steps away. When the fog finally began to dissipate, as if an invisible giant exhaled after a long inhalation, we found ourselves scattered, disoriented, struggling to understand what had happened. The camp, once full of life and activity, was eerily silent. We gathered, recounting to each other, and that's when we realized the horrifying truth. Some of us had disappeared. There were no signs of struggle, no trails to follow. They had simply vanished without a trace, as if the fog had devoured them. The search was frantic. We combed every inch of the surrounding jungle, calling out the names of the missing, hoping for an answer that never came. But the jungle remained impassive, its secrets hidden behind a veil of vegetation and silence. The return to the barracks was somber. How to explain the inexplicable, how to report the incomprehensible. Our superiors' questions felt distant, almost irrelevant. What could we say? That a fog had arisen from nowhere and taken our comrades? That we had heard voices that didn't belong to this world? Since then, I have been tormented by dreams, visions of the fog returning, enveloping me, dragging me into the darkness where the voices whisper eternally. And I fear the jungle of Morelos hides a deep mystery, an enigma beyond human understanding. Those who were lost in the fog were never found, and over time their names became mere statistics, footnotes in official reports that dared not tell the full story. But I know the truth. I know there are things in this world that defy logic, that there are horrors hiding in the shadows and the thickness of the jungle, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. And as I write this, I cannot shake the feeling that the fog still surrounds me, that its secrets remain there, hidden in the darkness, whispering, calling me back to the jungle of Morelos, to a fate I can neither understand nor dare to face. But this story must be told as a warning, as a reminder that not everything can be explained, and that some mysteries must remain unsolved, hidden in the dense fog that devours everything. Our detachment had been sent to a remote area to conduct reconnaissance and ensure the security of the region. The jungle of Durango, vast and mysterious, hid more than just the raw beauty of nature. It concealed ancient secrets none of us were prepared to face. On the third day of patrol, we stumbled upon something unusual. An ancient indigenous cemetery hidden among the thick jungle. The graves, arranged in concentric circles, seemed to hold centuries of silence. Stones adorned with symbols we didn't recognize marked each tomb. Despite the unease this generated, we decided to camp near the site, a decision that would change our lives forever. That night, the starry sky and the symphony of the jungle formed a peaceful contrast to the day filled with marches and exploration. However, our rest was interrupted by unsettling dreams we shared upon waking. Visions of shadowy figures dancing around a fire, whispers in forgotten tongues, and the feeling of being watched from the darkness. At dawn, reality struck our faces like the cold morning wind. 4 of my comrades woke up with strange tribal marks on their skin. Lines and symbols twisted on their arms and chests as if they had been tattooed overnight by an invisible hand. Confusion and fear took hold of us. None of them remembered getting those marks, and there was no evidence of tattoo equipment in our camp. Our superiors decided we needed to return to base to examine the marks and receive medical attention. However, the jungle, which had been a green labyrinth of life and mystery, transformed into a hostile environment, filled with whispers and shadows moving at the edge of our vision. The march back was torturous. The marked comrades began to behave strangely, murmuring among themselves in a language we didn't understand. Their eyes reflected a mix of fear and fascination, as if they were in a trance. With each step towards civilization, we felt something following us, watching, whispering. Upon reaching the base, our superiors were incredulous at our story. The marks were examined by doctors who couldn't provide a logical explanation. They weren't burns or cuts, but pigmentations that seemed to have emerged from within the skin, impossible to erase or alter. The following days were filled with interrogations, medical exams, and a growing sense of alienation. The marked comrades were isolated for further study, while the rest of us grappled with our own anxieties and the uncertainty of the unknown. I couldn't shake the images of the indigenous cemetery and the marks now adorning my friends. I needed answers. One night I decided to return to the jungle. I needed to see the place once more to find something we had missed. The jungle at night is a completely different world. The sounds, the darkness, the feeling of being watched. But my determination pushed me forward, guided by the light of my flashlight and the memory of the path we had taken. Upon reaching the cemetery, I felt an atmosphere charged with energy. The stones seemed to vibrate with an ancient and tragic history. I approached one of the graves and, without knowing why, extended my hand towards the symbols carved into the stone. At that moment, a wave of images and emotions hit me with the force of a hurricane. I saw faces and landscapes, battles and rituals, love and despair. A story of an ancient people, their connection to the land, their struggle and their eventual fall. The images were so intense, so real, they left me breathless. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the visions. When I regained my breath, I realized something in me had changed. I looked at my hand, and to my astonishment, the same marks that had appeared on my comrades now adorned my skin. I understood then that these marks weren't a curse, but a gift, a message from the past. They were a reminder that this place, and perhaps all of us, are connected in ways we are just beginning to understand. I returned to the base with a new purpose. We needed to preserve that place, learn from it, respect the memory of those who had lived and died there. My superiors were skeptical, but the marks on my skin were evidence they couldn't ignore. The following days became a mix of diplomacy and study. Archaeologists and anthropologists were called to the site. A project was initiated to study the cemetery and, more importantly, to protect it. My comrades and I were part of that process, transformed not just in skin, but in spirit. The marks on our skin faded over time, but the imprint they left on our souls remains. We learned about the culture and history of those who came before us, finally understanding that respect and memory are the true guardians of the secrets of the past. My military service is over, but the lesson I learned in the jungle of Durango will stay with me forever. The stories of our ancestors, the marks of their existence, must not be forgotten. They must be honored, studied, and above all, respected. Now as the scars on my skin fade, I know I will never forget what I lived through. The jungle, the cemetery, the marks have become part of who I am. A reminder that in this vast and complex tapestry of life, we are all connected, past, present, and future. The heat was suffocating and the humidity was unbearable. The only interruptions to the bird's song and the mosquito's buzz were the captain's orders and the boat's engine's squeak. I was Lieutenant Garcia, and this was my third trip down the Amazon. The mission: to escort a shipment of medical supplies to an indigenous village deep in the jungle. A routine trip, or so I thought. We had been navigating for hours, and the scenery had become monotonous. Endless trees, vines hanging like snakes, the sky barely visible through the foliage. Suddenly, the captain shouted, "Stop! Look at that!" We all leaned over the side. What we saw left us frozen. The river, which had been a murky brown until now, was now a deep red. Blood red. A sepulchral silence took over the boat. The captain, with a trembling voice, ordered, "Sergeant Lopez, prepare the boat. Lieutenant Garcia, accompany me." We got off the boat cautiously. The red water reached our knees. A nauseating smell filled the air. We advanced with difficulty along the riverbank, dodging the dense vegetation. Suddenly the captain stopped dead. "Here," he said in barely audible voice. In front of us on the riverbank lay a body. A dark-skinned man in tribal clothing was lying on his back. His body was covered in cuts and mutilations. His face, frozen in an expression of terror, was the most horrible thing I had ever seen in my life. He wasn't the only one. A few meters away, we found another body and another. All belonged to the same tribe. All had been brutally murdered. The scene was grotesque, a bloodbath in the middle of the jungle. The captain looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and determination. "We have to find those responsible," he said firmly. We began to explore the area, looking for clues, anything that would tell us what had happened. It wasn't easy. The jungle was dense, the vegetation impenetrable. We advanced slowly, careful not to step on any evidence. After 2 hours, we found something that chilled our blood. A rudimentary altar made of branches and stones was stained with blood. In the center, on a carved stone, there was a still-beating human heart. At that moment, a guttural sound chilled our blood. A roar, a howl, coming from the depths of the jungle. We looked at each other, the fear palpable on our faces. "Captain, I think that—" I began to say, but couldn't finish the sentence. A man, or what seemed like a man, emerged from the undergrowth. He was tall, with sun-tanned skin and long black hair. His eyes shone with a wild light, and in his bloodied hands he held an obsidian knife. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a deep, guttural voice. The captain raised his weapon, pointing it at the man. "Surrender," he ordered. The man smiled a cruel and merciless smile. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. And then, with a quick movement, he lunged at us. The captain fired, but the man dodged the bullet with superhuman agility. In the blink of an eye, he was upon us. We fought fiercely, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The man was strong, brutal, unstoppable. I received a cut on my arm, and the captain a wound in his abdomen. Just when it seemed all was lost, a deafening sound echoed in the jungle. A roar, a bellow coming from the depths of the river. Suddenly the water began to churn, to boil. A giant wave of blood red rose from the river and swallowed the man in an instant. What followed was chaos. The red wave swept away everything in its path: trees, animals, the boat. We clung to a fallen tree branch, holding on for dear life as the crimson wave dragged us downstream. The water roared around us, splashing us with its horrific color. I felt nauseous from the smell of blood and the violent movement. When the wave receded, we found ourselves exhausted and bruised on the muddy shore. The river had returned to its normal course, the usual murky brown. I looked around, my heart still pounding in my chest. The altar, the bodies, everything had disappeared. Only desolation and the sepulchral silence of the jungle remained. "Captain, Captain," I called out in a trembling voice. There was no response. I crawled to where I had last seen him, and there he was, lying face down in the mud, motionless. His abdominal wound was bleeding profusely. "Captain, hold on, we're getting out of here," I shouted desperately, but my words sounded hollow even to myself. I checked his pulse. Nothing. The captain was dead. Anger and sadness overtook me in equal measure. I was alone, lost in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by death and horror. The images of the massacre, the wild man, and the red wave haunted me. I closed the captain's eyes with a gesture of respect and then, with superhuman effort, tried to focus. I had to get out of there alive. I pulled out my combat knife and cut a piece of my shirt to make an improvised bandage for my wounded arm. Then I inspected the boat. It was overturned and partially submerged, the engine unusable. My only option was to walk. I looked at the sky, searching for the sun to orient myself. I knew that to the east was the indigenous village we were headed to. I took the captain's backpack, which contained a rudimentary map of the area, and began to walk, venturing into the jungle with reverential fear. The following hours were a nightmare. The jungle was an oppressive, humid green labyrinth. Every branch crack, every animal sound made me jump in fright. Hunger and thirst tormented me. At night, the fear intensified. The jungle sounds became a cacophony, and the shadows seemed to come to life. I didn't sleep, I couldn't. I barely dared to close my eyes for fear of what I might find when I woke up. At dawn on the second day, I was exhausted, on the brink of collapse. My feet were destroyed, and the arm wound was beginning to infect. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me stop in my tracks. A chant, a faint rhythmic sound coming from the distance. It was a human voice. I recovered a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was the indigenous people. Maybe they could help me. I gathered my last strength and walked with renewed vigor towards the source of the sound. It took what felt like an eternity to get there. Emerging from the jungle's thick vegetation, I found myself in a clearing. In the center was an indigenous village with wooden and thatched huts. A group of men and women in tribal attire were performing a ceremony, singing and dancing around a bonfire. I approached them cautiously, raising my hands in a sign of peace. The indigenous people looked at me with surprise, then with suspicion. I tried to speak to them in Spanish, in Portuguese, in any language I could, but they didn't understand me. However, through gestures and facial expressions, I managed to make them understand that I was alone, injured and lost. They welcomed me with caution, but also with humanity. They treated my wound, gave me water and food. In the following days, I tried to communicate with them to find out what had happened at the river. I discovered that they belonged to a rival tribe of the one that had been massacred. They told me legends of an ancient evil that inhabited the river, a vengeful spirit that demanded human sacrifices. The killings at the river were rituals to appease this entity. By shooting the wild man, the captain had broken an ancestral taboo, awakening the river spirit's wrath. The red wave was a manifestation of its power. The sun beat down on our heads as we advanced through the arid mountainous region. Dust rose with each step, creating a haze that made visibility difficult. The heat was suffocating, the thirst unbearable. I was Sergeant Lopez, and this was a mission I would never forget. The order was to investigate a series of attacks by a blood-sucking creature dubbed by locals as El Chupacabras. We had heard terrifying stories, animals mutilated without a drop of blood, with 2 small punctures on their necks. Some villagers even swore they had seen the creature, a humanoid beast with sharp fangs and blood-red eyes. At first, most of us didn't believe in those superstitions. We thought it was some wild animal, an unknown predator, but the evidence was irrefutable. The attacks were multiplying, fear spreading like a plague. We had been scouring the region for days, interrogating locals looking for clues, but we found nothing concrete. The creature seemed to act at random, leaving no trace. One night, while we camped under a starry sky, Sergeant Garcia, a man hardened by 1,000 battles, confided his worries to me. "Lopez, this doesn't smell right to me. I don't think we're dealing with a common animal." "I know, Garcia," I replied, "but so far we have no proof otherwise." That same night, horror struck close to home. A soldier, young Perez, was found dead in his tent. His body was pale, bloodless, with 2 small punctures on his neck. A chill ran down my spine. The chupacabras had attacked in our own camp. The tension was palpable. The soldiers murmured, some even talked of deserting. I couldn't allow that. We had to find the creature, no matter the cost. The next day, we divided the squad into small groups to cover more ground. I joined Captain Martinez's group, a brave and experienced man. We scoured the area for hours, finding nothing. Frustration and fear began to take hold of us. Suddenly, a guttural sound chilled our blood. A terrifying howl came from the mountains. "There! Look!" shouted one of the soldiers, pointing towards a cave on the mountain slope. From the cave emerged a humanoid creature with scaly skin and blood-red eyes. Its sharp fangs gleamed in the sunlight. The chupacabras. Captain Martinez, without losing his composure, ordered us to open fire. The bullets struck the creature but seemed to have no effect. The chupacabras roared in fury and charged at us with terrifying speed. A fierce battle ensued. We shot at the creature, stabbed it, but nothing seemed to stop it. Its sharp claws tore through flesh, its fangs. One by one, my comrades fell. Captain Martinez was the last to succumb. The creature lifted him off the ground and bit his neck, drinking his blood greedily. I was the only one left. Terrified, but with adrenaline coursing through my veins, I pulled a grenade from my bulletproof vest and threw it at the creature. The explosion was deafening. A shower of stones and dust enveloped us both. When the cloud dissipated, the creature was gone. Only a smoking pool of blood remained on the ground. I fell to my knees, exhausted and trembling. I had survived, but at a high cost. My comrades, my friends, had died because of a creature most considered a myth. I will never forget that night. The night I faced the chupacabras and saw darkness and horror take over the sunlight. Upon returning to the base, I reported what had happened. Some believed me, others did not. But one thing was certain. The chupacabras was real, and I was the only witness to its existence. I've lived with the memory of that night for years. A memory that torments me, that forces me to look over my shoulder every time I walk down a dark alley or venture into a forest. I've left military life. I couldn't bear the thought of facing something like that again. But the nightmares haunt me. I dream of the chupacabra's red eyes, its fangs closing in on my throat. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. A few days ago, I received a package in the mail. I opened it cautiously, and inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping. It was an article about animal attacks in a remote area of South America, attacks that eerily matched those of the chupacabras. Scrawled in handwriting on the margin of the clipping were the words, "It's not over, Lopez. It's still out there." The blood froze in my veins. Fear flooded me like a torrent. I don't know who sent that message or what their intentions are, but one thing is certain. The chupacabras is still on the loose, and maybe, just maybe, I'm the only one who can stop it. I've been training since then, learning survival techniques, hunting, and self-defense. I've researched everything I could about the chupacabras, looking for any weakness, any weapon I could use against it. I don't know if I'll face it again, but what I do know is that I can't sit idly by. I can't let it continue murdering innocent people. So I'm preparing my gear, making plans. I don't know where I'm going or when, but I will find it. And this time, I won't let it escape. This time, the chupacabras will face an enemy who not only has weapons and training, but also a burning thirst for revenge. Adrenaline pumped through my body as I boarded the plane that would take me back to South America. The newspaper clipping was crumpled in my pocket, a grim reminder of my goal. The journey was long and interminable. Every air pocket, every turbulence made me jump from my seat, imagining a sharp claw tearing through the fuselage. Upon landing, the humid heat enveloped me like a suffocating shroud. I headed to the area mentioned in the clipping, a small, dusty village nestled in the mountains. The villagers' fear was palpable. They spoke of mutilated animals, shadows lurking at night, and a strange silence that heralded the creature's arrival. I spent days interviewing the villagers, reconstructing the attack pattern. The chupacabras seemed to follow a specific route, attacking isolated farms along a narrow valley. One night, an old man told me a local legend. He spoke of a cursed creature, a man-beast hybrid that roamed the mountains, thirsty for blood. According to the legend, the only way to kill it was with a silver dagger blessed by a shaman. The story sounded far-fetched, but at that moment, any hope was a beacon in the darkness. I contacted a local shaman, a man weathered by time, with eyes that seemed to know the forest's secrets. The shaman looked at me with suspicion upon hearing my story. After a long silence, he agreed to help me. He handed me a silver dagger gleaming in the moonlight and murmured an ancient incantation. With that weapon in hand, I felt a little safer, though I was still aware of the madness of my mission. At dawn, following the gathered clues, I ventured into the valley. The sun barely penetrated the forest's thick foliage, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Every branch crack, every bird flutter set me on edge. After hours of walking, I reached a cave hidden behind a waterfall. A malevolent energy emanated from its depths. I knew the chupacabras was there. I took a deep breath and entered the cave. The air was cold and damp. The smell of blood and decay churned my stomach. I guided myself with the dim light of my flashlight, revealing the bones of unfortunate animals. Suddenly, a bone-chilling roar echoed through the cave. The chupacabras emerged from the shadows, its scaly body gleaming in the flashlight's beam. Its red eyes pierced me like daggers. The fight was brutal. The creature was strong and agile, its claws scratching me several times, but I was determined to end this. I dodged its attacks, looking for an opportunity. I saw it, the neck, the same marks of its fangs on other bodies. With a battle cry, I thrust the silver dagger forward. The metal sank into the chupacabra's flesh, eliciting a howl of pain. The creature staggered back, its red eyes dimmed. It collapsed with a thud. I approached cautiously, still holding the dagger, waiting for any sign of life. But there was none. Only an inert body, a bloodthirsty beast, finally at peace. I stumbled out of the cave, exhausted and wounded, but a sense of relief coursed through me. The chupacabras was dead. I returned to the village, welcomed as a hero. But the victory had a bitter taste. There were many dead I couldn't bring back. My experience will never stop haunting me. But at least I know that for a while the people of that region will be safe. Now I live with the hope that this is the last time I'll face the supernatural. But I know that legends persist for a reason. And if I've learned anything, it's that the world is full of dark secrets, and horror is always around the corner. The sun barely penetrated the thick foliage, creating a gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. I was Lieutenant Garcia, and this mission was one of the strangest I had ever experienced. Our objective, to investigate a tribe of cannibal aborigines who, according to reports, lived deep in the jungle. We had heard terrifying stories, macabre rituals, human sacrifices, and a taste for human flesh. Many of my comrades didn't believe in those superstitions, but I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. We had been navigating the Amazon River for days, following a rudimentary map provided by a local shaman. The scenery was monotonous, an endless green stretching as far as the eye could see. One day, while we were advancing along a narrow tributary, we spotted a village in the distance. The wooden and thatched huts stood on stilts on the riverbank. An expectant silence reigned in the place. As we approached, a group of aborigines came out to greet us. They were men and women with dark skin and robust build, wearing tribal attire made of feathers and skins. Their eyes watched us with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The expedition's captain, a man hardened by 1,000 battles, addressed them in a local dialect he had learned for the occasion. After a brief exchange of words, they invited us into the village. At first, everything seemed normal. The aborigines showed us their homes, offered us food and drink. But as the day progressed, I began to notice unsettling details. The children looked at us with terror, whispering among themselves in a language we didn't understand. At one point, I separated from the group to explore the village on my own. Suddenly, I found myself facing a rudimentary altar made of stones and branches. In the center, on a carved stone, was a human skull with cut and bite marks. A chill ran down my spine. There was no doubt these aborigines were cannibals. I returned to the captain and told him what I had seen. At first, he didn't believe me. But then one of the soldiers found a cauldron with human remains in one of the huts. The tension was palpable. The soldiers murmured. Some even talked of deserting. The captain, with a tense voice, ordered, "Prepare your weapons. We're getting out of here." At that moment, a group of aborigines armed with spears and arrows surrounded us. Their faces were distorted with fury, their eyes shining with a wild light. Without a word, they attacked us. The battle was brutal. The aborigines were fierce, fighting with tremendous strength. Several of my comrades fell to the ground, killed by the enemy's spears and arrows. I fought with a mix of fear and rage. I shot my rifle, stabbed the enemies who approached me, but there were too many. Just when it seemed all was lost, a deafening sound echoed through the jungle. A roar, a bellow coming from the depths of the river. Suddenly a giant wave of blood-red water rose from the river and swallowed the aborigines in an instant. What followed was chaos. The red wave swept away everything in its path. Huts, trees, the boat. We clung to the branches of fallen trees, holding on for dear life as the crimson wave dragged us downstream. When the wave receded, we found ourselves exhausted and bruised on the muddy shore. The river had returned to its normal course, the usual murky brown. I looked around, my heart still pounding in my chest. The village, the aborigines, everything had disappeared. Only desolation and the sepulchral silence of the jungle remained. I don't know what caused that red wave. Maybe it was a natural phenomenon, an act of nature. Or maybe it was something else, something supernatural, a vengeful force that protected the tribe from intruders. What I do know is that I will never forget that day. The day I faced the cannibal aborigines and saw how the jungle's fury saved us, or condemned us. We left that area as if the devil were chasing us. We were decimated, traumatized. The death of my comrades weighed on us, and the vision of the red wave and the vanished aborigines had become a recurring nightmare. We returned to the military base in a sepulchral silence. The official report on the mission was ambiguous, avoiding mention of the cannibal aborigines and the blood wave. However, I couldn't remain silent about what I had seen. I spoke with the captain in private, with the base psychologist, but no one believed me. They considered it stress-induced delusions from the mission. I isolated myself from the rest of my comrades. I felt a deep distrust of the jungle, of the unknown. But even more, I was tormented by doubt. Had the red wave been our salvation or part of a macabre ritual? Weeks later, a new case landed on my desk. A group of researchers had disappeared in the same area where we had been. Authorities suspected local guerrilla attacks. A surge of adrenaline and fear ran through my body. I couldn't stay idle. I had to return to the jungle, had to discover the truth about the aborigines and the red wave. I convinced the captain, this time under the pretext of searching for the missing researchers. We assembled a small team, only the most experienced soldiers and myself. As we ventured back into the jungle, a feeling of oppression enveloped me. The heat, the humidity, the silence broken only by the insects' song. Everything seemed to conspire to remind me of the horror I had lived. This time we moved with more caution. We followed the trail of the missing researchers, looking for any clues. Days of walking without finding anything. Hope dwindled with each sunset. Then we found it. An abandoned camp with the researchers' belongings scattered on the ground. And in the center, an altar of stones, just like the one I had seen in the village. There was no doubt. The aborigines had attacked here, but something didn't add up. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just an eerie silence. As we explored the camp, I heard a guttural sound coming from the undergrowth. A sound that chilled my blood, the same roar that had preceded the red wave. My heart raced. I shouted to my comrades to take cover, but we weren't fast enough. From the undergrowth emerged enormous muscular figures with skin painted in vivid colors and sharp fangs protruding from their mouths. They were men, but not like those I had seen before. These creatures had superhuman strength and a wild look in their eyes. The fight was bloody and unequal. We fired our weapons, but the bullets bounced off their bodies as if they were stone. One by one, my comrades fell to their ferocity. I tried to escape, running into the jungle in hopes of losing them. I ran aimlessly, my heartbeats echoing in my ears. Suddenly I tripped and fell to the ground. When I got up, I found myself in a clearing. In the center, an imposing figure watched me, taller than the others with an exotic feather crown on its head. It seemed to be their leader. He spoke in a guttural language I didn't understand, but his look said it all. I was his prey. I closed my eyes tightly, waiting for the final blow. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard the same deafening roar. I opened my eyes and saw the leader creature stepping back, looking towards the river with terror. Then I saw it. The red wave was rising once again, threatening to engulf everything. The leader creature roared an order to his followers, and all of them fled into the jungle, disappearing into the undergrowth. The red wave arrived with a roar, sweeping away everything in its path. I clung to a fallen tree, holding my breath as the crimson water battered me. When the wave receded, I was exhausted, shivering with cold. The jungle was in complete silence, broken only by the sound of the river returning to its normal course. This time there was nothing. No village, no aborigines, no trace of my comrades, only an even deeper desolation than before. I emerged from the jungle like a specter, staggering and delirious. They found me days later, downstream, clinging to a drifting log. I don't know how long I had been wandering, but the trauma and exposure had left me on the brink of madness. In the military hospital, under the watchful eyes of doctors and psychologists, I tried to piece together the events. I spoke of the cannibal aborigines, the giant creatures, and the red wave, but my words were again discredited. Post-traumatic delirium, stress-induced hallucinations, they said. No one believed me. But I know what I saw. The cannibal aborigines are real, and there's something else in that area, something ancient and powerful that dwells in the river's depths and protects its territory with terrifying fury. Now I live in seclusion, tormented by the memories. I'm an outcast in my own squadron, a man marked by the inexplicable, but I still believe in what I saw, and part of me longs to return and uncover the truth. Perhaps it's madness, perhaps it's obsession, but something tells me the story isn't over. The jungle holds secrets yet to be revealed, and the red wave could re-emerge at any moment as a terrible warning. And I, the only witness, the only survivor, can't help but wonder. Who is the real prey in this macabre game? The bloodthirsty aborigines, the hidden river creatures, or the intruders who dared to disturb their world? I was Corporal Rodriguez, and this mission was one of the most tedious I had ever experienced. Our objective, to patrol a mountainous area with no signs of enemy activity. We had been walking for hours, finding nothing but endless vegetation and bird song. The monotony was exhausting, the boredom a constant threat. Suddenly a soldier, young Perez, stopped dead. "Careful!" he shouted, pointing to a branch at face level. On the branch was a huge, jet-black spider, with hairy legs, watching us with its 8 bright eyes. It was the largest a spider I had ever seen. "Relax, Perez," I said. "It's just a spider." "It's not just any spider, Corporal," Perez replied with a trembling voice. "It's a venomous spider. Its bite can be deadly." I approached the spider cautiously, fascinated by its size and menacing appearance. I watched it for a few seconds, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear. "Don't worry, Perez," I said. "I'm not going to touch it." At that moment, the spider jumped towards me with terrifying speed. I tried to dodge it, but I wasn't fast enough. Its fangs sank into my flesh, injecting a burning venom into my body. A sharp pain shot through my arm, followed by a feeling of numbness. The area around the bite began to swell and redden. "It bit me!" I shouted, feeling panic take over. Perez rushed to me quickly. "Stay calm, Corporal," he said, trying to keep his composure. "We're going to get you out of here." Perez helped me walk back to the camp, while I felt the venom spreading through my body. The swelling increased, breathing became difficult, and a terrible nausea churned my stomach. Upon reaching the camp, the medic examined me immediately. "It's a very dangerous spider bite," he said gravely. "The venom is acting fast." They administered an antidote, but the pain didn't subside. Fever took hold of me, and I began to delirious. Images of the giant spider haunted my dreams. Its bright eyes watched me, its fangs nearing my throat. Each time I woke up, reality was even worse. The pain was unbearable, my vision blurred, and death felt closer with each passing moment. In a moment of lucidity, I looked at Perez, who was sitting by my bedside, keeping watch over me. "Perez," I said in a weak voice, "if I die, I want you to tell my family that I love them." Perez looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. "You're not going to die, Corporal," he said firmly. "You're going to make it through this." But I knew the truth was different. Death was inevitable. I spent the last hours of my life in a state of agony, fighting against the venom consuming me. My thoughts blurred, my body surrendered. The last image I remember is Perez's face, full of sadness and helplessness. I died alone, in a distant jungle, a victim of a venomous spider. My death was a slow and painful agony, a cruel and unexpected end for a soldier who was only doing his duty. My story is a warning to all those who venture into the wild. Venomous spiders are a real threat, a silent danger that can lurk in any corner. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember, a spider bite is not always just a minor annoyance. It can be the beginning of a slow and agonizing death. The sun was mercilessly burning on the back of our necks as we moved through the dense jungle. The heat was suffocating and the humidity unbearable. Each step was a titanic effort, and the undergrowth seemed to swallow us with its green jaws. We were an elite battalion, hardened in 1,000 battles, but nothing had prepared us for the hell that awaited us in the depths of the Amazon jungle. Our mission was simple: to locate and rescue a group of scientists who had disappeared in the region. But soon we realized we had underestimated the danger. Rumors of a tribal war circulated among the locals, but no one had warned us of the magnitude of the conflict. The two tribes, the Yanomamis and the Kayapos, were engaged in a relentless struggle for control of the territory. It was not just a war over land, it was a war for survival, and we unknowingly had been caught in the middle. The first signs of war came in the form of guttural cries echoing in the night. Then we found the mutilated bodies of some poachers, and finally we came across the completely devastated Yanomami village. The Kayapos had attacked without mercy, massacring men, women, and children. Horror took hold of us. I had never seen so much death and destruction, and we knew it was only the beginning. The following days were hell. We advanced cautiously, rifle in hand, expecting an attack at any moment. The tension was palpable and fear hung in the air. And then it happened. One morning, while resting in a clearing, we were surprised by a rain of arrows. The Kayapos attacked us with ferocity, using all the weapons at their disposal: spears, arrows, machetes. The battle was brutal, bloody, and relentless. Comrades fell beside me, their bodies riddled with arrows. I myself took an arrow to the arm, but the adrenaline kept me from feeling the pain. We fought like cornered beasts with the sole idea of surviving. In the end, thanks to our superior weaponry and training, we managed to repel the attack. But the victory was bittersweet. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? Many of my comrades had died, and those of us who remained were physically and psychologically wounded. And the worst of all, it was only the beginning. We still had a long way to go, and we knew the Kayapos would not give up easily. The war of the tribes had just begun. The following days were a nightmare. We moved through the jungle like ghosts, stalked by death at every corner. The Kayapos attacked us relentlessly, using their cunning and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Every step was a risk, every breath an agony. Food was scarce, water was rotting, diseases began to take their toll, and little by little, hope began to fade. Many of my comrades started to lose their minds. Some deserted, others committed suicide. I myself was on the brink of the abyss. The horror of war, the loss of my friends, the uncertainty of the future. It was too much to bear. One day, while wandering disoriented through the jungle, I met an elderly Yanomami. He was the sole survivor of the massacre of his village. He spoke to me of the war, of the atrocities committed by both sides, of the pain and suffering he had witnessed. And he also spoke to me of the prophecy, an ancient legend that spoke of the end of the war. According to the prophecy, only a warrior with a pure heart would be able to unite the tribes and bring peace to the region. I don't know if I believed it at the time, but his words echoed in my head for days. A warrior with a pure heart. Was it me? Was there anything pure left in my heart after all I had seen and done? However, the prophecy became a glimmer of hope in the midst of darkness. We had to find the missing scientists, but now I also had another goal, to find a way to stop the war. With the help of the Yanomami elder, I learned more about the customs and beliefs of the tribes. He told me about their rituals, their gods, their fears, and little by little I began to understand the roots of the conflict. The war was not just for territory, but also for resources that were becoming increasingly scarce due to deforestation and the expansion of civilization. One day, while crossing a mosquito-infested swamp, we came across a Kayapo camp. They were young warriors with bodies painted for war and fierce looks in their eyes. We prepared for combat, but then I remembered the elder's words. Instead of shooting, I stepped forward and dropped my weapon. The Kayapos were stunned, suspicious. With the elder acting as an interpreter, I spoke to them about the destruction, the pain, and the prophecy. I told them the story of the massacre of the Yanomami village and the sadness it caused me. To my surprise, some Kayapo warriors bowed their heads in shame. One of them, a young man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He spoke of the loss of his brother at the hands of the Yanomamis and the hatred that consumed his heart. The conversation was long and tense, but gradually an understanding began to take shape. In the end, we reached an agreement. A temporary ceasefire to allow us to find the scientists, and then a meeting between the leaders of both tribes to negotiate peace. It wasn't easy to convince my comrades to trust the Kayapos, but in the end, desperation and the hope of finding the scientists alive outweighed everything else. The search continued, but now with a difference. We were escorted by Kayapo warriors. Days later, we arrived at an abandoned camp. The signs indicated that the scientists had been there but had been captured. We followed the trail that led us to a remote area of the jungle, a sacred place for the Kayapos. There, in a clearing surrounded by giant trees, we found the scientists. They were alive but weakened and frightened. They had been captured by the Kayapos, not as hostages but as guests. The Kayapos believed that the scientists were shamans sent by their gods to help them resolve the conflict. The surprise was huge. The scientists, of course, had no magical powers, but had knowledge that could be useful to both tribes. We took advantage of the situation to bring the leaders of the tribes together. The meeting was tense, filled with resentment and distrust. But with the help of the scientists, who acted as mediators, and thanks to the seed of peace we had planted in the previous encounter, we managed to lay the foundations for an agreement. The scientists explained the importance of environmental conservation and the sustainable exploitation of resources. They promised to help both tribes adapt to the new times and find solutions to the problems that plagued them. The negotiations lasted days, but finally, a peace treaty was signed. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. The wounds of war would take time to heal, but at least the bloodshed had stopped. We, the soldiers, became observers, guarantors of the agreement. And I, the soldier who would never consider himself a man of pure heart, became a kind of symbol of hope. The story of how a soldier, thanks to the help of an indigenous elder and a prophecy, managed to stop a tribal war spread through the jungle. I don't know if the story was true or not, but it served for something, to plant the seed of peace. And that, in the midst of the horror we had witnessed, was the only thing we had left. Weeks passed until we finally managed to leave the jungle. We were emaciated, sick, with our souls in tatters, but we also emerged alive, with an incredible story to tell and an indelible lesson. The civil war had not been completely eradicated, but hostilities had ceased. The tribes worked with the scientists to find a way of sustainable coexistence. And I, upon returning to civilization, was not the same man who had entered the jungle. The experience had transformed me. The nightmares tormented me at night, but I also carried with me a strange sense of hope. I had seen the abyss of barbarism, but I'd also witnessed a glimmer of humanity in the midst of conflict. And that was something I would never forget. My return to normal life was difficult. The city seemed noisy, chaotic, superficial to me. My comrades treated me with a mixture of respect and morbid curiosity. The media sought me out to tell the story, but I didn't want to be a hero. I was just a soldier who had survived hell and learned a hard lesson. War is not always the answer. Years later, I dedicate myself to giving talks in schools and universities. I speak to young people about the dangers of war, the importance of peace, respect for nature, and indigenous cultures. I don't know if my words achieve anything, but at least I try. I try to convey the hope I found in the middle of the jungle, the hope that human beings can overcome our differences and build a better world. Because in the end, the story of the War of the Tribes is not just a story of horror. It is also a story of humanity, of redemption, of the struggle for peace, even in the heart of the deepest darkness. Sweat soaked my uniform in the Peruvian jungle. It was a constant torture, and the humidity clung to my skin like a second layer. Each step was a titanic effort, and the undergrowth seemed to swallow us with its green jaws. We were an elite battalion, hardened in 1,000 battles, but nothing had prepared us for the hell that awaited us in the depths of the Amazon. Our mission was simple: locate and destroy a guerrilla base operating in the region. But soon we realized we had underestimated the enemy. The guerrillas were relentless, using brutal and ruthless tactics. Ambushes, sabotage, landmines, anything was valid to eliminate government forces. And the worst of all was that they seemed to be everywhere. They moved like shadows through the jungle, camouflaged among the vegetation, invisible to our eyes. The guerrilla war became a deadly game of cat and mouse, a game where death was the only reward. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The tension was constant, fear an inseparable companion. Paranoia took hold of us, and each soldier began to see enemies in the shadows. The first to fall were the youngest, the most inexperienced. A hidden sniper would take their life with a single shot, not giving them time to react. Then the veterans, those who had survived the cruelest wars, began to die. The guerrillas laid deadly traps, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Each death was a wound to the soul, an irreparable loss, and impotence was the worst torture. I myself was saved by a miracle on several occasions. A bullet grazed my head, another pierced my bulletproof vest. Death danced around me, mocking me. I began to lose count of the days, nights, and missions. The jungle became a maze with no way out, a nightmare from which it was impossible to escape. One day, while advancing along a narrow path, we were surprised by a rain of fire. The guerrillas attacked us from the heights, using grenade launchers and assault rifles. The battle was brutal, bloody, and relentless. Soldiers fell around me like flies, their bodies riddled with bullets. I myself received a wound in my leg, but adrenaline kept me from feeling the pain. I fought like a cornered animal with the sole idea of surviving. In the end, thanks to our superior firepower, we managed to repel the attack. But the victory was bittersweet. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? Many of my comrades had died, and those of us who remained were physically and psychologically wounded. And the worst of all, it was only the beginning. The guerrilla war was not a conventional war. There were no battlefronts, no rules, no mercy. It was a dirty war, a war without end. And we soldiers were just pieces of meat on a macabre chessboard. The following months were hell. The guerrillas had infiltrated the local population, making it impossible to distinguish between friends and enemies. Every village, every house, every person was a potential danger. Paranoia consumed us, and distrust became our only ally. Search and destroy operations became suicide missions. The guerrillas attacked us by surprise and then vanished into the jungle like ghosts. Death became something commonplace. We saw it in the eyes of our comrades, in the faces of civilians, in nature itself. The guerrilla war was dehumanizing us, turning us into soulless killing machines. One day, while returning from a failed operation, we found a burned village. The guerrillas had massacred all the inhabitants, men, women, and children. The scene was Dantean, a picture of horror that I will never forget. The charred bodies, the faces contorted in pain, the dry blood staining the ground. The stench of burned flesh clung to our clothes, our lungs, our souls. At that moment, something broke inside me. Rage, impotence, despair, fused into an explosive cocktail. I lost control. I screamed, cursed, cried. I felt sanity slipping through the cracks of my helmet. My comrades watched me with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew I was the next to lose my mind, the next to succumb to the madness that guerrilla war instilled in our minds. But that emotional outburst cleansed me, or so I thought. I returned to the battle with a new objective: to avenge the innocent victims, to eradicate the guerrillas from the face of the earth. My determination was a flame that burned fiercely, but it was also a double-edged sword. The following days were a spiral of violence. We became obsessed hunters, tracking the guerrillas with an insatiable thirst for blood. We executed suspects without prior trial, razed entire villages in search of information. The lines between good and evil blurred completely, and the most terrifying thing was that the guerrillas seemed to feed on our cruelty. Their attacks became bolder, more sadistic. They began to leave macabre messages on the bodies of our comrades, using psychological warfare tactics that sunk us even deeper into the abyss of madness. One night, while guarding an outpost, we were attacked by a large group of guerrillas. The battle was fierce. Tracer bullets drew lines of fire in the dark. The cries of the wounded mingled with the explosions of grenades. Amid the chaos, I lost contact with my unit. Alone, disoriented, I wandered through the jungle for days, with the enemy stalking me in every shadow. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion were consuming me. Hallucinations took hold of me. I saw deformed faces in the undergrowth, heard voices calling my name. I was on the verge of collapse, about to become another victim of the jungle. But then I found it. A small wooden cabin, almost camouflaged by the vegetation. With a last bit of strength, I dragged myself towards it, hoping to find refuge. When I opened the door, an indigenous elder looked at me in surprise. He didn't speak Spanish, but his gestures indicated that I should stay quiet. For days he hid me from the guerrillas, feeding me with roots and wild fruits. Though we couldn't communicate with words, he conveyed a sense of peace and humanity that I had long forgotten. In his eyes I saw sadness for the war, but also a firm determination to survive. When I regained enough strength to leave, the elder gave me a wooden amulet, a good luck charm. I don't know if it worked or if it was mere coincidence, but I managed to find a reconnaissance patrol. My return to the camp was met with disbelief. They had given me up for dead. I was a broken man, a specter of the soldier who had entered the jungle. The war had ended, at least for us, but the victory tasted like ashes. We had managed to expel the guerrilla from the area, but at an incalculable price. Many of my comrades had died, and those of us who remained were marked forever. The nightmares torment me at night. I see again the faces of my fallen comrades, the spilled blood, the destroyed innocence. The amulet of the indigenous elder rests on my bedside table, a reminder of the peace we lost and the humanity we almost forgot in the heart of the jungle. The guerrilla war was fought not only on the battlefield, but also in our minds and hearts. And it is that battle that I still fight, not knowing when or if I will ever find true peace. Our mission: locate and destroy a drug trafficker camp operating in the region. But soon we realized we had underestimated the danger. The narcos were ruthless, using brutal and merciless tactics. Ambushes, snipers, landmine, anything was valid to eliminate government forces. And worst of all, we weren't just facing them. There was something else in the jungle, something that stalked us from the shadows, something that watched us with hungry eyes. The first to fall were the youngest, the most inexperienced. A terrifying roar paralyzed them, followed by a deadly silence. We never found their bodies. Then the veterans, those who had survived the cruelest wars, began to die. Their bodies appeared mutilated, with strange marks on their skin. Paranoia took hold of us. Each soldier began to see monsters in the shadows, to hear howls in the night. I myself was saved by a miracle on several occasions. A shadow grazed my head, A roar left me deaf for an instant. The beast was stalking me, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I began to lose count of the days, nights, and missions. The jungle became a maze with no way out, a nightmare from which it was impossible to escape. One day, while advancing along a narrow path, we were attacked by a rain of bullets. The narcos attacked us from the heights, using assault rifles and grenades. The battle was brutal, bloody, and relentless. Soldiers fell around me like flies, their bodies riddled with bullets. I myself received a wound in my arm, but adrenaline kept me from feeling the pain. I fought like a cornered animal, with the sole idea of surviving. In the end, thanks to our superior firepower, we managed to repel the attack. But the victory was bittersweet. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? Many of my comrades had died, and those of us who remained were physically and psychologically wounded. And the worst of all, it was only the beginning. The beast would not give up. It would continue stalking us, hunting us until none of us were left. The following months were hell. Paranoia consumed us, and distrust became our only ally. Every village, every house, every person was a potential danger. Death became something commonplace. We saw it in the eyes of our comrades, in the faces of civilians, in nature itself. The beast was a constant presence in our lives. Its roars echoed in the night, its tracks marked the ground. One day, while returning from a failed operation, we found a group of mutilated indigenous people. Their bodies were torn apart, their clothes stained with blood. The scene was Danteon, a picture of horror that I will never forget. At that moment, something broke inside me. Rage, impotence, despair, fused into an explosive cocktail. I lost control. I screamed, cursed, cried. I felt sanity slipping through the cracks of my helmet. My comrades watched me with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew I was the next to lose my mind, the next to succumb to the terror that the beast instilled in our souls. But that emotional outburst cleansed me. Or so I thought. I returned to the battle with a new objective: to avenge the innocent victims, to eradicate the beast from the face of the earth. My determination was a flame that burned fiercely, but it was also a double-edged sword. The following days were a spiral of violence. We became obsessed hunters, tracking the beast with an insatiable thirst for blood. We executed suspects without prior trial, razed entire villages in search of information. The lines between good and evil blurred completely, and the beast, as if feeding on our chaos, became more active, more audacious. Its attacks became unpredictable, deadly. It stopped playing with us and began to hunt with terrifying efficiency. One night, while guarding an improvised camp, the ground shook with a deafening roar. The beast emerged from the undergrowth, a grotesque creature that defied all logic. It was enormous, with colossal muscles and black skin like the night. Its sharp fangs dripped saliva, and its yellow eyes shone with inhuman ferocity. Terror paralyzed us. Bullets bounced off its thick skin without causing harm. In the blink of an eye, the beast tore one of my comrades apart, his screams drowned by the crunch of bones. The carnage lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the beast retreated with its macabre prey, only the survivors remained, trembling on the ground, stained with blood and with their sanity shattered. From that moment on, hunting the narcos became secondary. Our only mission was to survive the beast. We abandoned conventional military tactics and resorted to desperate measures. We set deadly traps, placed homemade explosives, even consulted a local shaman who provided us with hallucinogenic brews supposedly capable of driving away the creature. Nothing worked. The beast always found a way to outsmart us, eliminating us one by one. Isolation, constant fear, omnipresent death were driving us mad. Hallucinations took hold of us, nightmares became reality. We began to distrust each other, to see enemies in our own comrades. The jungle became a living purgatory, and the beast was our personal demon. One day, only 3 of us were left. Physical and mental exhaustion was such that we could barely hold our rifles. We knew the beast would find us. It was only a matter of time. In a last show of desperation, we decided to set a trap. We dug a huge pit in the center of a clearing and covered it with branches and leaves. Then we positioned ourselves strategically, waiting for our enemy to arrive. Night fell like a black shroud, laden with an ominous silence. Then we heard it, the deafening roar that announced the beast's arrival. It approached stealthily, unhurried, like a predator savoring its prey. We jumped from our hiding places and opened fire. Tracer bullets drew lines of fire in the dark, but the beast dodged them with surprising agility. It pounced on one of my comrades and with colossal strength threw him into the covered pit. My comrade's screams quickly faded, drowned by the earth. Panic seized me. I fired wildly, tears mixing with the sweat and dirt on my face. Suddenly the beast stopped as if something had caught its attention. It turned its grotesque head towards the pit and let out a high-pitched, almost human scream. Then from the darkness of the hole another creature emerged. It was smaller than the beast, but with the same grotesque form and the same black skin. They roared at each other, facing off in a deadly duel. I took advantage of the confusion to escape. I didn't look back. I ran like a madman through the jungle, not caring about the direction, just getting away from that cursed place. I don't know if my comrades survived, or if the beast eliminated its rival. I also don't know if I was the only survivor of that doomed battalion. What I do know is that I will never be able to forget the unknown beast, the creature that stalks in the depths of the jungle, the monster that stripped us of our humanity and left us at the mercy of madness and terror. I managed to escape the jungle, but the jungle never left me. The scars on my body, both physical and mental, are a constant reminder of the hell I lived through. The nightmares visit me every night, transporting me back to the damp darkness, to the deafening roar of the beast, and to the screams of my comrades. They discharged me from the army with honors, but there is no honor in surviving when so many have perished. Guilt eats away at me. Could I have done more? Did I make the right decisions? The questions torment me with no answers in sight. I tried to return to civilian life, but the transition was brutal. The city's noise terrified me, and people seemed alien to my reality. I took refuge in alcohol, seeking to drown the demons that pursued me. One day, hitting rock bottom in a dirty bar, I met an old local hunter who had ventured into the jungle in search of gold and returned empty-handed with a chilling story. His tale was similar to mine, though he spoke of a cursed tribe that worshipped a demonic beast. His story sparked something inside me. I couldn't live with the fear. I couldn't let the beast win. I had to know what it was, where it came from, and if there were more like it lurking in the shadows. So I sold everything I had, bought supplies and equipment, and headed back to the jungle. Not as a soldier, but as a hunter. This time I would not be searching for narcos, but for the beast. The road back was difficult. The jungle, once familiar, now seemed hostile, full of ghosts and painful memories. But I pressed on, driven by a fierce determination. Using my military knowledge and the hunter's clues, I tracked the cursed tribe. I found their abandoned village, evidence of a fierce struggle. I don't know if the beast killed them or if they killed it, but the area emanated a dark energy. Then, following a trail of blood and bones, I ventured into the deepest part of the jungle, an unexplored territory full of hidden dangers. Days and nights passed with no trace of the beast. Hunger, thirst, and loneliness conspired to break my will. But just when I was about to give up, I heard it. It wasn't the deafening roar I remembered, but a lower sound, like a plaintive whimper. I followed it cautiously until I reached a clearing where sunlight barely penetrated. There was the beast, but it was not the invincible creature that had terrified me. It was wounded, bleeding, its enormous body defeated by something unknown. A chill ran down my spine. I don't know if it was pity for the wounded creature or terror at what had defeated it. At that moment, a crack made me turn my head. In the branches of a giant tree, another even more terrifying creature watched the scene. It was smaller than the wounded beast, but its eyes shone with a malignant intelligence. It was the real enemy, the predator for which the cursed tribe had been sacrificed, the creature that had turned the other beast into nothing more than a terrified puppet. I understood then that the jungle harbored more secrets than we ever imagined, secrets that could unleash chaos and destruction. I knew I couldn't face this new threat alone, but I also couldn't stand by and do nothing. So I escaped from the jungle again, this time with an even graver mission: to tell the world what I had seen, to warn them of the dangers hidden in the depths of the Amazon. I know they will call me crazy, that no one will believe me, but I don't care. I have seen horror with my own eyes, and I will not rest until someone listens to me. The jungle has already taken its toll, but it hasn't broken me. I will not let the beast or any other threat lurking in the darkness win the battle. My fight, my new war, has just begun. In the depths of the Amazon, our mission was locate and destroy a guerrilla base operating in the region. But soon we realized we had underestimated the enemy. The guerrillas were relentless, using brutal and ruthless tactics. Ambushes, sabotage, landmines. Anything was valid to eliminate government forces. And worst of all, we weren't just facing them. Paranoia took hold of us. Each soldier began to see monsters in the shadows, to hear wails in the night. I myself was saved by a miracle on several occasions. The sound seemed to come from all directions, confusing and disorienting me. The last time I found myself on the brink of a precipice, fascinated by the call. I clung to the earth with the last of my strength, and terror gave me the power to pull away. I began to lose count of the days, nights, and missions. The jungle became a maze with no way out, a nightmare from which it was impossible to escape. One day, while advancing along a narrow path, we were attacked by a rain of bullets. The guerrillas attacked us from the heights, using assault rifles and grenades. The battle was brutal, bloody, and relentless. Soldiers fell around me like flies, their bodies riddled with bullets. I myself received a wound in my leg, but adrenaline kept me from feeling the pain. I fought like a cornered animal with the sole idea of surviving. In the end, thanks to our superior firepower, we managed to repel the attack. But the victory was bittersweet. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? Many of my comrades had died, and those of us who remained were physically and psychologically wounded. And the worst of all, it was only the beginning. The call would not give up. It would continue attracting us, hunting us until none of us were left. The following months were hell. Paranoia consumed us, and distrust became our only ally. Every village, every house, every person was a potential danger. Death became something commonplace. We saw it in the eyes of our comrades, in the faces of civilians, in nature itself. The call was a constant presence in our lives. Its sound echoed in the night, its echoes reflected in the treetops. One day, while returning from a failed operation, we found a group of mutilated indigenous people. Their bodies were torn apart, their clothes stained with blood. The scene was Danteon, a picture of horror that I will never forget. At that moment, something broke inside me. Rage, impotence, despair, fused into an explosive cocktail. I lost control. I screamed, cursed, cried. I felt sanity slipping through the cracks of my helmet. My comrades watched me with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew I was the next to lose my mind, the next to succumb to the terror that the call instilled in our souls. But that emotional outburst cleansed me. Or so I thought. I returned to the battle with a new objective: to avenge the innocent victims, to eradicate the call from the face of the earth. My determination was a flame that burned fiercely, but it was also a double-edged sword. The following days were a spiral of violence. We became obsessed hunters, tracking the source of the call with an insatiable thirst for blood. We interrogated the few remaining indigenous people, paying with scarce provisions for fragmented information. The legends they told us spoke of a malevolent entity inhabiting the depths of the jungle, a being that lured the unwary with its deadly song. Its name varied among the tribes, but the terror it inspired was universal. Determined to break the cycle, we followed a trail of clues, devoured animal carcasses, giant footprints that did not match any known creature, and the smell of decay that permeated the air as we ventured into forbidden territory. Then we heard it. It was not a guttural lament like before, but a melodic, almost hypnotic song. Its beauty was unsettling, like a carnivorous flower attracting a fly with its sweet scent. I felt an irresistible attraction to the source, but I gripped my rifle tightly to resist. I saw several of my comrades stagger, their eyes glazed over as if they were about to succumb to the call. I fired into the air, the noise breaking the spell. My comrades looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and anger. We knew the entity was close. We continued cautiously, our senses on high alert. The jungle became denser, the sunlight barely penetrating the tangled vegetation. The air grew heavy, charged with palpable electricity. And then we saw it. It was not a beast with fangs and claws as I had expected, but a column of light rising from a clearing in the jungle. The light was multicolored, as beautiful as it was lethal. My comrades, unable to resist any longer, charged toward the light like insects drawn to a flame. My shouts did not reach them. They were engulfed by the very song. An instant later, the light intensified, blinding me momentarily. When I could see again, my comrades had vanished. Only an eerie silence remained, broken only by the buzzing of insects. Terror paralyzed me. I was alone, at the mercy of an entity that had just devoured my comrades without a trace. I backed away slowly, but fear kept me from running. Suddenly, a searing heat hit my back. I turned and saw that the column of light had expanded, approaching me at alarming speed. I knew I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes tightly, expecting death, but it didn't come. When I opened my eyes, the light was gone. I was on my knees in the clearing, trembling like a leaf. I didn't know how much time had passed or how I had survived. I looked around, searching for any sign of my comrades, but there was nothing, only the disturbing stillness of the jungle. At that moment, I knew I was the sole survivor. Guilt and pain overwhelmed me. Why me? What had I done to deserve to live? But survival is a primary instinct. I got up with difficulty, my body aching from the trek and the terror. I had to get out of there. I had to return to the base and report what had happened. The journey back was hell. Every rustle in the underbrush, every bird's flap made me jump. The call of death was no longer a beautiful song, but a constant reminder of the horror I had witnessed. Days later, disoriented and exhausted, I emerged from the jungle. When a soldier saw me, he didn't recognize me. I had become a specter, a man marked by death. I told my story to the lieutenant, but my words sounded delirious. A soldier disappearing for days and then reappearing, speaking of malevolent entities, was not the best way to earn belief. They sent me home with honors, but with doubts. The mission had failed, and I was the only survivor returning with an unbelievable story. I have tried to move on, but the jungle and the call haunt my dreams. The physical scars have healed, but the mental ones remain open. I know no one will believe me, but what I saw in the jungle is real. The call of death stalks the unwary, and I was the only one fortunate or unfortunate enough to escape. Now I live tormented by the question, why did I survive? Am I the only one who resisted the call, or is there something more at play? Perhaps the entity has plans for me, a macabre role I do not yet know. I cannot afford to ignore it. I am meeting with experts in Amazonian folklore and mythology, seeking information about the entity and any weaknesses it may have. I have contacted other soldiers who have served in the region, searching for whispers, rumors of mysterious disappearances or unexplained phenomena. My quest may take me back to the jungle, to the place that terrifies and obsesses me in equal measure. But I have no choice. I must unravel the mystery of the call of death, not just to save myself, but to prevent it from claiming more innocent lives. I know I will fight this battle alone, but I will not give up. I am the last witness, the sole survivor, and the jungle has not finished with me yet.